Before we drift away, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more calming sleep stories. Sweet dreams await. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, soft at first, then steady, then heavy enough to blur the road ahead. The forest seemed endless on both sides of the winding trail, trees pressed close together, their wet bark shining black under the dim headlights. When the lodge finally appeared, it rose out of the mist like something half forgotten. Its roof sagged under years of weather, its windows glowed faintly with a dull orange light, and the smoke from a fire curled lazily into the night. I stepped out of the car, boots sinking into mud, the sound of rain on leaves louder now that the engine was silent. The lodge looked welcoming yet strange. It stood deep in the forest where no roads should lead, as if it had been waiting for me. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and damp wood. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and shadows moved across the walls. A chair sat beside the flames, empty. Another sat across from it, also empty. Someone had been here recently. The rain beat harder on the roof. The forest pressed closer against the windows. I could hear the trees shifting in the wind, creaking as though they were alive. That was when I noticed the sound. Beneath the steady patter of rain and the hiss of the fire, there was something else. A whisper. Low, broken, almost human. It came from the dark hallway at the back of the lodge. And though every instinct told me not to move closer, my feet carried me toward it anyway. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, fading into a darkness that swallowed the weak glow from the fire behind me. The air grew colder as I walked, each step pressing against the creaking wood beneath my boots. The whispering grew clearer now, though I still couldn't make out words, only the sound of something speaking just out of reach, like a voice pressed between walls. The smell of damp earth filled the air, though there should have been none. The lodge was old, but not rotten, not enough to let the forest seep in like this. My hand brushed along the wall as I moved, the wood strangely wet to the touch, as if it had been rained on inside. A sudden gust rattled the window somewhere behind me. The rain hammered harder against the glass, a relentless tapping that made it difficult to tell where the whisper ended and the storm began. I turned a corner, and the hallway opened into another room. It was a dining hall, wide and empty. A long wooden table stretched from one end to the other, its surface uneven, scarred by age and fire. 6 chairs stood neatly pushed in as though waiting for guests. At the head of the table sat a single candle. Its flame flickered weakly in the draft, though there was no sign of anyone who could have lit it. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse. My breath sounded too loud, too heavy. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, and I had the strange feeling that the forest outside had gone quiet too, as if holding its breath. I stepped closer to the table, the candle flame tilting as though it reacted to me. And then, from somewhere deeper in the house, a door slammed shut. The sound jolted through the walls, loud and sharp. The flame of the candle guttered but did not go out. The slam had not come from the storm outside. It was too heavy, too deliberate. Someone else was here. I turned quickly, scanning the dining room, then the doorway behind me. Empty. The shadows seemed to shift when I looked away, but nothing moved when I stared directly at them. I forced myself to breathe slower, though the chill of the room bit into my skin. The slam came again, closer this time. And in that moment, the whispers returned, but not from the walls, not distant this time. They came from the table itself, from the empty chairs. Low murmurs filled the air, weaving together, words almost forming, but never clear enough to understand. The candle's flame bent sharply as though pulled by an unseen breath. And then, every chair scraped back at once. The sound of the chairs moving was deafening in the silence of the dining hall. The wooden legs scraped against the floorboards all at once, sharp and deliberate as if pulled by invisible hands. I froze, my pulse hammering, unable to believe what I had just seen. The chairs had shifted away from the table in perfect unison, leaving the candle at the center trembling on its base. I stepped back, my boots catching against the uneven floor, the shadows of the tall chairs stretching unnaturally against the walls. The firelight from the main room flickered faintly through the open doorway behind me, but it looked farther away than it should have, as if the hallway had stretched longer since I had entered. The whispering returned, stronger now. It rolled out from the table in waves, voices overlapping, layered on top of each other, speaking words that made no sense yet felt oddly familiar. They weren't just whispers anymore. They sounded closer to breathing, dozens of uneven breaths filling the air in time with the storm outside. The candle sputtered. Its flame bent sideways as though something stood just beyond sight, exhaling across the wick. For a brief second, the flame nearly went out. In that flash of almost darkness, I thought I saw the outline of shapes sitting in the chairs. faint outlines like shadows with no bodies to cast them. When the light steadied again, the chairs were empty, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. The rain beat harder against the windows, a steady drumming that seemed to surround the room on all sides. I turned my head, trying to orient myself, but the sound pressed in so thickly it was impossible to tell where it came from. It was as if the forest itself had gathered around the lodge, listening. And then the floor creaked. Not beneath me, beneath the table. I stared at the long wooden table, heart lodged in my throat, waiting for movement. At first, there was only silence, only the sound of rain and my own breathing. Then something shifted under the tablecloth. The fabric rippled once, then again as if brushed from beneath. I took another step back, bumping into the cold frame of the doorway, my hand clutching the edge. "Leave," a voice whispered. This time it wasn't muffled, wasn't broken. It was clear, sharp, and close enough that I felt the air of it against my ear. I spun, expecting someone to be standing behind me, but the doorway was empty. The hallway stretched into darkness, the faint firelight flickering in the distance. When I turned back toward the table, the candle was gone. The chairs were tucked neatly back in place. The room looked untouched, as though nothing had ever moved at all. And yet, the whisper lingered in my head, circling, repeating itself. Not an invitation. Not a warning. A command. I stepped into the hallway, the air heavier now, my skin damp not from rain but from the cold seeping out of the wood itself. The fire still crackled faintly in the lodge's front room, but it sounded distant, almost muffled. The storm outside had grown louder, lightning flickering through the thin curtains over the windows. I stood in the hall, frozen between the choice to flee back outside into the forest, or press deeper into the lodge. And then, from the far end of the hallway, another door creaked open on its own. A strip of blackness yawned from the gap, waiting. The door at the far end of the hallway stood slightly ajar, its shadow stretching toward me across the warped boards. The sound of the storm pressed closer, seeping through the wood as though the forest outside had shifted nearer to the walls. Each roll of thunder trembled faintly through the frame, low and heavy, but beneath it was something else. A faint tapping, irregular, like fingers against hollow wood. I hesitated, one hand still resting against the wall, the chill of damp timber soaking into my skin. The fire in the front room was almost an echo now, muffled and faint, like the memory of warmth rather than the thing itself. The lodge had begun to feel less like a building and more like a living thing, its bones groaning and breathing around me. I moved toward the door slowly, each step stretching the silence between the storm's bursts of thunder. The boards creaked under my boots, long drawn-out sighs, as if the house was warning me not to continue. Yet, with each step, the whisper I had heard earlier returned, faint but guiding, like it wanted me to open that door. When I reached it, the tapping stopped. The gap between the frame and the door was wide enough to see only darkness inside. I pressed my fingers against the edge, the wood slick with condensation. For a moment, I thought about turning back, leaving the lodge entirely and facing the rain-soaked forest instead. But something in me knew it was already too late. Once I had stepped inside this place, the forest outside would never feel safe again. I pushed the door open. The room beyond was colder than the hallway, and the smell of wet earth hit me immediately, stronger than before. It was as though the forest had seeped directly into the lodge, bringing with it soil, moss, and the faint copper tang of waterlogged leaves. My boots sank slightly as I stepped inside, not on wood but on damp ground. The floor of this room was covered in dark soil, uneven and soft, as though it had been carried in by hand and left to rot. The storm outside roared louder in here, and yet there were no windows. Only walls, warped and leaning, and above me beams blackened with age. The room stretched farther than it should have, as if the space had grown larger than the lodge itself. The flickering light from the hall behind me did little to cut through the dark. And then I noticed the circle. In the center of the soil was a ring of stones, carefully placed, each wet with rain though the ceiling above was solid. Inside the ring was ash, charred remains of wood. A fire pit built indoors, long cold. But as I stared at it, the faintest thread of smoke curled upward from the blackened ashes, twisting toward the beams. I crouched slightly, peering closer, the damp smell thick in my throat. My mind told me it was impossible. There was no heat, no flame, no ember left. And yet I could see the smoke, thin, fragile, and steady. Then I heard it, the sound that made the air leave my chest. Breathing. It came from within the circle, low and rhythmic, like something sleeping just beneath the soil. Each inhale pulled the ash inward. Each exhale released a faint drift of smoke. The hairs along my arms lifted, and the chill of the room deepened. I took a step back, but the earth shifted beneath me, soft and unsteady, as if something under the ground had moved in answer to my retreat. The whisper returned. Not behind me this time. Not around me. It came from the circle. Sit. The soil quivered with the word, and the stones around the pit trembled faintly, as if shivering from the voice itself. I stumbled back into the hallway, nearly colliding with the frame. The door swung farther open behind me, the dark soil room yawning wider, the faint breath continuing. And as I staggered back toward the distant fire, another sound broke through the storm. Knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks against the front door of the lodge. The sound of the knocks cut through the lodge like the crack of an axe into wood. 3 strikes. Slow. Deliberate. Each one echoed in my chest, vibrating through the damp boards beneath my boots. The whispering from the soil room faded instantly, as if silenced by whatever had arrived outside. For a moment, all I could hear was the storm, the steady drumming of rain, the hiss of wind pushing against the walls, and that faint, uneven breathing I feared might not be my own. I turned my head toward the front of the lodge, the flicker of the firelight barely reaching me now. The warmth that had once seemed inviting felt pale, distant, as though it belonged to another place altogether. Still, I moved slowly back down the hallway, each creak of the floor stretching louder than the storm. The knocks came again. 3 more. Louder this time. When I reached the main room, the fire in the hearth was still burning, though smaller, as if it had been left unattended for too long. Its glow painted the room in trembling orange, shadows sliding across the wooden beams. I could see the front door clearly now. Tall, heavy, made of dark timber streaked with years of water damage. The handle twitched. I froze, breath held, heart hammering. It wasn't subtle. The handle of the lodge door turned slowly, metal grinding against its frame, stopping just short of unlatching. Something, or someone, was on the other side. Lightning flashed outside, the brief blaze of white leaking through the cracks around the frame. In that split second of light, I thought I saw a shadow shift beneath the door. Tall, thin, motionless. Then darkness swallowed it again. The handle went still. I stayed rooted to the spot, unable to look away. The silence stretched long enough that I almost believed it was over, that perhaps it had only been the storm or the warped wood shifting. But then the knocking came again. This time it didn't stop at 3. It went on, uneven, frantic, as though fists, too many fists, were pounding against the wood. Each blow shook dust from the beams above, rattled the glass of the nearby window, made the fire flicker violently. The storm outside seemed to quiet for those few seconds, the forest itself listening as the relentless pounding consumed the air. And then it stopped. I dared to exhale, though the air tasted wrong. Stale, heavy, damp with the smell of soil and rot. I realized the fire had dimmed almost to nothing, embers glowing weakly under the ash. The room felt darker, smaller, as though the walls had inched closer during the noise. From behind the door came a new sound. A whisper. It slid through the cracks around the frame, curling into the room, faint but sharp enough to cut through the storm. I couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm, rising and falling like chanting. My ears strained to understand, to catch even a fragment, but the language slipped away like water through fingers. And then silence. The fire sputtered one last time before going out, plunging the lodge into complete darkness. Only the storm remained, its steady roar pressing against the windows, wrapping the building in rain. And in that thick, suffocating dark, the whisper came again. Closer now, inside the room. The fire was gone, swallowed so completely that even the glow of embers seemed impossible. The hearth was only a dark mouth, empty and cold. The storm outside filled the silence, but even its rhythm seemed different now, less natural, less like rain and more like thousands of tiny fingers rapping against the windows and roof. I stood in the center of the main room, unable to move, listening. The whisper came again. This time it wasn't from the door. It was beside me. Low, harsh, close enough that I felt the breath of it across my skin. I turned sharply, eyes straining against the dark, but there was nothing. Only the vague outlines of furniture barely visible in the storm's dim flashes of lightning. The chairs, the stone hearth, the rough beams. All exactly where they had been before. But the whisper didn't stop. It multiplied. First 1 voice, then 2, then 5. They layered together, words bleeding into each other, overlapping until the sound became unbearable. I pressed my hands against my ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't just in the room anymore. They were inside my head, curling around thoughts, sliding into places that should have been silent. I staggered back, nearly tripping over a rug that hadn't been there before. My hand brushed against the wall, and it was damp, slick as though rain leaked through, though I knew the storm could not reach this deep. The voices swelled louder, pulling me toward the front door. I fought against it, but my legs felt heavy, unsteady, moving almost without command. Another flash of lightning split the forest outside, and for the briefest moment the windows glared white. Something stood in the yard, tall, motionless, facing the lodge. The light died before I could see its shape clearly, but I knew it had been there. A figure rooted among the trees waiting. The voices cut off instantly. Silence crashed down, louder than the storm itself. My breath sounded ragged, too loud, the only human noise in the lodge. My eyes adjusted slowly, and that was when I noticed the faintest glow coming from the hallway behind me. It was not firelight. It was pale, cold, shifting like mist through the cracks of the open door that led back into the soil-covered room. The glow pulsed faintly as though it were alive, and the air grew colder with every flicker. I should have fled then. I should have torn the front door open, storm or not, forest or not, and never looked back. But my feet betrayed me, carrying me down the hall again, step by step, toward that unnatural glow. The boards creaked beneath me, long and heavy, the kind of sound that made it feel like the house was sighing in despair. When I reached the doorway, the soil room had changed. The circle of stones was lit with faint blue fire, tiny tongues of cold flame rising from the ashes. The glow seeped into the damp soil, painting the beams above with shifting shadows that looked like twisted branches. The breathing was louder now, steady and slow, as though the entire room exhaled in rhythm. The whisper returned, louder, clearer, threading through the flames. Sit. The command hit me harder this time, echoing through the walls, vibrating in my ribs. My knees buckled, and I stumbled forward, nearly falling into the ring of stones before catching myself. My hands sank into the damp soil, cold seeping up into my bones. The blue fire hissed, bending toward me as though drawn by my breath. And in its glow I saw them. Shapes, figures, dozens of them. Standing just beyond the circle, half hidden in the shadows. Too tall, too still. Their faces were nothing but pale hollows, but their attention pressed down on me like weight. The air left the room in a single, heavy gust. The flames bent sharply. And then, all at once, the figure stepped closer. The soil was cold beneath my hands, damp enough that it clung to my skin like paste. The longer I knelt there, the more it seemed to pulse faintly, almost as if the ground itself had a heartbeat. My breath came out shaky, uneven, each exhale vanishing into the mist that rolled off the ring of stones. The circle burned with a pale blue light, but there was no heat, only a hollow cold that sank deeper into me the closer I leaned. The figures stood just beyond that glow. At first, I thought they were nothing but tricks of shadow and firelight, silhouettes warped by the movement of the pale flames. But the longer I stared, the less I could deny them. They were tall, each one standing perfectly still, their bodies so thin they almost seemed carved from the shadows themselves. Where their faces should have been, there were only pale, hollow ovals, empty of features yet somehow locked onto me. The blue fire crackled faintly, but it was not the sound of burning wood, it was the hiss of water dripping onto hot stone, the crack of ice breaking. It carried with it the smell of soil and rain, strong enough to drown out the storm outside. The longer I remained, the less I could hear the thunder at all. The whisper came again, louder this time. Sit. The word pressed into me like a hand on my chest, forcing the air from my lungs. My knees buckled without my permission, sinking deeper into the damp soil. My palms pressed flat against the earth, dirt smearing up my arms as I struggled to resist the pull. But the more I fought, the heavier it grew, until resisting felt like pressing against the weight of the entire forest. The figures moved. Not much, not suddenly, but their heads tilted all at once in perfect unison. A slow, careful tilt as though examining me. The motion was so human and yet so wrong in its precision that my stomach tightened. A rush of wind filled the room, but it didn't come from the storm. It came from the circle. The blue flames bent inward, collapsing toward the center, spinning into a spiral that pulled the air with it. The ashes at the bottom shifted, lifting in the current, and for a moment I thought I saw something beneath them. Not earth, not wood, something pale, something bone-like. I stumbled back onto my feet, heart pounding, the whisper still circling in my ears. I wanted to leave, to flee the room and slam the door behind me, but when I turned toward the hallway, it wasn't there. The soil room stretched on in every direction, the walls lost to mist, the lodge gone entirely. The doorway I had stepped through was nowhere to be seen. The circle was the only thing left. The blue fire surged higher, and the whisper became a chorus. Dozens of voices layered together, speaking the same word over and over again. Sit, 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 sit. The soil shifted beneath my boots. It gave way like waterlogged ground, sucking me downward. I fought against it, pulling one leg free only for the other to sink deeper. The cold seeped up my body as though the earth wanted to claim me. My breath came faster, ragged, but there was nowhere left to run. The shadows pressed closer, and their faceless heads tilted farther, watching. The circle pulsed once, like a heartbeat, and then the flames died. Darkness swallowed everything. The silence was so absolute it roared. For a long, terrible moment I thought I had gone deaf. But then, faintly, the sound of the storm returned. The rain against the roof, the groan of old beams, the whisper of wind through trees. And when my eyes adjusted, I was no longer in the soil room. I was back in the main hall of the lodge. The fire had returned to the hearth, crackling faintly as though it had never gone out. The chairs sat neatly in place. The windows rattled with rain. Everything looked exactly as it had when I first arrived. But the soil clung to my hands. The smell of damp earth still filled my lungs. And when I turned toward the dark hallway again, the door to the soil room was shut tight. From the other side, faintly, came the sound of breathing. The fire in the hearth looked too calm. Its flames wavered lazily, painting the stone walls in soft gold, as though nothing strange had ever happened. If I had arrived at that moment, I might have thought the lodge was nothing more than a forgotten shelter deep in the woods, a place to escape the storm for a night. But the soil clinging to my hands told another story. My fingers trembled as I stared at the dirt under my nails, the damp streaks smeared across my sleeves. It wasn't imagined. I had touched it. I had sunk into it. I had felt the weight of voices pulling me under. And now, though the room around me looked familiar, it felt wrong. The warmth of the fire didn't touch me. The walls seemed too close. The air carried the smell of earth instead of wood smoke. And from the hallway behind me, the one that led to the soil room, the breathing continued. It was faint at first, buried under the storm's constant rhythm, but the longer I listened, the clearer it grew. Slow, heavy, ragged breaths. Something waited on the other side of that door, and the sound of it was steady, patient. I had the sense that it wasn't rushing, wasn't desperate. Whatever it was, it knew I was here and it had time. I wanted to leave. Every instinct told me to grab my coat, throw the lodge door open, and vanish into the forest no matter how hard the rain fell. But the memory of what I'd seen outside in the lightning flash rooted me to the spot. That figure, tall, unmoving among the trees, still lingered in my mind. The thought of stepping outside and finding it waiting at the edge of the yard was worse than the thought of staying in here with the whispers. The breathing deepened. I turned toward the hallway, my heart pounding with each step. The storm rattled the windows, but the sound of it was beginning to feel muffled again, as though the lodge itself wanted me to focus only on that door. The wood of the door was darker now, swollen with damp, the grain warped like veins. I stared at it, the breathing unmistakable. It wasn't the sound of a man resting or a woman sighing. It was heavier, animalistic. What? As though each inhale dragged through waterlogged lungs. I reached for the handle. My fingers hovered over it, slick with sweat, trembling. For a moment, I almost convinced myself not to touch it, to turn back, to retreat into the fire's glow. But the breathing changed. It stopped. The silence was worse. My hand hovered in the air, waiting for the next inhale, waiting for proof that something was still behind the wood. But the seconds stretched too long. The silence pressed against me like a weight, and I realized the only way to break it was to act. I gripped the handle. The metal was cold, slick as though someone else's hand had just left it. I pulled slowly, the hinges groaning. The crack of darkness widened, the storm's light flickering faintly down the hall behind me. The door opened only a few inches before I froze. Something was there. Not in the room beyond. Not standing back in the shadows. But pressed against the other side of the door. I couldn't see it, not fully, but I felt it. The wood was heavy in my hand, resisting, as though a body leaned against it from the inside. And from that thin gap, cold air rolled out, damp and foul, carrying with it the smell of soil and rot. Then, in the darkness of that small opening, an eye appeared. It wasn't human. Too large. Too pale. The color of ash. It glistened wetly in the dim light, unblinking, locked onto me with a hunger so sharp it made my throat close. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut with a cry. The breathing returned instantly, louder now, pressed against the wood, heavy enough to rattle the frame. And then came the knock. Not at the lodge's front door this time. At the hallway door. 3 slow, heavy knocks. Each one shaking dust from the beams above, each one vibrating through the floor. The storm roared outside. The fire sputtered. The knocks came again. And when I dared to step closer, I saw that the wood was splintering beneath the blows, as though the thing behind it no longer cared to wait. The firelight flickered against the windows, warping my reflection into something pale and unfamiliar. The storm outside had grown heavier, rain hammering against the glass so hard it was almost impossible to hear anything beyond it. And yet, I was certain I did hear something, faint, muffled, but deliberate. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't thunder. It was heavier, slower, and it repeated at intervals that made my skin tighten. Footsteps. I rose from the chair by the hearth and crept closer to the window. The forest beyond was little more than a blur of black and gray, smeared by rain. The lodge stood like a fragile island in the storm, firelight spilling across the floorboards, while the outside remained impossibly dark. At first I thought I had imagined it. The rain played tricks on the senses. But then I saw it, something moving just beyond the treeling. A figure, not clear, not fully there, only a darker shape among shadows. It stood still for a moment, too still, as though it was waiting for me to notice. Then, in an instant, it was gone. My throat tightened. I wanted to believe it had been a trick of the storm, but when I pulled back from the window, I noticed the fire had weakened again, its flames shrinking to a dim glow. The warmth that filled the room earlier was fading, leaving behind a cool, damp draft. The lodge seemed to breathe with me, every creak and groan of its old frame echoing like the inhale and exhale of something alive. I gathered more wood from the pile beside the hearth, hands trembling as I fed the flames. The fire roared back, spitting sparks, and for a moment I felt relief. Yet even as the lodge filled with warmth again, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. I avoided the windows this time. The idea of looking out into the storm and finding something looking back at me made my chest heavy. The rain intensified and I thought I heard another sound, closer now, right against the walls of the lodge. Not footsteps this time, but scratching. Slow, dragging scratches that began at one end of the wall and continued to the other. I froze. The sound stopped when I did, as if listening for me. My heart beat against my ribs, loud enough, I feared, for whatever was outside to hear. I backed away from the wall, retreating toward the fire. The flames seemed weaker already, their crackle hushed, their glow dimmer than it should have been. I whispered to myself, anything to fill the silence, but the storm swallowed my voice. The scratching returned, louder, more insistent, moving along the far side of the lodge toward the windows. And then came the knocking. 3 deliberate knocks, slow and heavy, on the front door. I didn't move. The rain drowned the world, thunder rolled across the forest, but nothing could hide the sound of that door shaking gently on its hinges as though something waited patiently to be let inside. I stared at the wood, trembling, certain I could see the faintest outline of a shadow beneath it. A pair of feet, motionless, silent, waiting, and then the fire hissed and nearly died. The silence after the knocking was worse than the knocking itself. 3 slow, deliberate thuds, then nothing. The storm raged on as if trying to erase the sound, but I knew what I'd heard. My breath was shallow, each inhale louder than I wanted it to be. I stayed frozen where I was, watching the door as though it might open of its own accord. The fire crackled weakly, throwing strange shapes across the walls, and every flicker of shadow looked like movement. I tried to convince myself it had been a branch, a falling piece of debris, anything at all, but there was something purposeful about it. A rhythm, a presence, the kind of knock that was not accidental. The draft worsened, as though the lodge itself had grown hollow. The warm cocoon the fire once gave me was thinning, replaced by a sharp cold that sank through my clothes and pressed against my skin. I wanted to add more wood to build the flames higher, but I couldn't bring myself to turn my back to the door. My eyes stayed locked on it, searching for the smallest shift, the faintest sign of what lingered outside. A thought crept into my mind: what if it had already come in? What if the knocking was only to distract me from where it had really entered? The walls groaned under the storm, the rafters shuddered, and I felt as though the whole building was bending inward, pulling me deeper into its dark frame. Then again, knock. Only once this time. Slow, heavy. It rattled the air inside the room. I nearly cried out, but swallowed it, choking it back, terrified that any sound I made would invite it closer. The storm dimmed for a fleeting second, as though pausing to listen with me. I forced myself to move, though my legs felt like stone. Step by step, I backed toward the hearth, my hands brushing the wooden chair for balance. The fire sputtered, low and desperate, its glow barely reaching the corners of the room now. I realized with a sinking horror that the shadows had grown deeper, denser, as though the flame was no longer strong enough to hold them at bay. I kept staring at the door. My mind raced. Should I bar it? There was no real lock, only an old iron latch that looked more decorative than secure. What good would it do, really, if something was determined to come inside? And yet, the thought of standing close enough to touch that door made my stomach twist. My eyes caught something I hadn't noticed before. At the very bottom of the door, in the narrow gap where the light of the fire barely reached, there was a darkness that seemed too thick, too unmoving. There wasn't shadow. It was shape. Two dark points side by side. The unmistakable suggestion of feet. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the chair. The fire hissed loudly, spitting sparks across the stone floor as though protesting, as though warning me. And then came the sound again, but not from the door. From the window this time. Tap, tap, tap. It was softer, almost delicate, like fingernails brushing glass. My head snapped toward it, but I could see nothing through the rain. Only the blur of water racing down the pane. The tapping continued, unhurried, following some rhythm I didn't recognize. The storm outside screamed and roared, yet somehow, I heard each sound clearly, as though it was meant for me alone. I didn't want to look, but my eyes betrayed me. I moved closer, against every instinct, drawn toward the window. My breath fogged the glass as I leaned near. The rain distorted everything beyond, but for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a face. Pale, hollow-eyed, pressed against the other side, vanishing the instant I blinked. I staggered back, heart pounding, and turned toward the fire again. It had nearly guttered out. The shadows were swallowing the walls, crawling across the ceiling. I scrambled to throw more wood into the hearth, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the logs. When the flames roared back, the warmth burst outward, filling the lodge again. Relief washed over me, but it was brief, because in the new light I noticed something on the floor by the door. Water. A thin, dark line of water that stretched inward from the threshold, winding its way across the boards as though something had already been here. And still, the knocking did not return. It was waiting. The thin line of water stretched from the door into the heart of the lodge, winding across the warped floorboards like a living thing. I crouched low to examine it, the cold seeping into my fingers through the wet wood. The trail wasn't wide, but it glistened unnaturally in the firelight, reflecting the flames in a way that made it seem almost alive. Each ripple, each bend, seemed deliberate, as if it had been left there for me to follow. I hesitated. My instinct screamed to turn back, to grab my coat and run into the storm. But a deeper, darker curiosity rooted me in place. Something about the trail called to me, whispered promises I didn't want to understand. I took a cautious step forward, the damp boards creaking faintly underfoot. The trail led toward the hallway, the one that disappeared into shadow when I first entered the lodge. I swallowed hard and followed it, each step measured, careful. The firelight did not reach far enough to illuminate the path completely. The hallway stretched before me like a tunnel of darkness, and the storm outside seemed to fade into a distant hum. Even the rain felt quieter here, as though the lodge itself had absorbed it, leaving only the sound of my boots and the faint trickle of water beneath them. The air grew colder the farther I went, dampness settling in my hair and clinging to my clothes. The scent of earth returned, faint but unmistakable, mingling with the faint, metallic tang of something I could not name. My pulse thudded loudly in my ears. Every nerve in my body screamed that I was not alone. And then I heard it. A whisper, low and guttural, coming from somewhere deep in the hallway. It was different this time, older, heavier, more deliberate. I couldn't make out words, but the tone alone made my skin crawl. It was calling me forward, guiding me along the trail. I pressed my back to the wall, my hand brushing the damp wood as I moved cautiously. The trail of water shimmered faintly, leading to a doorway I had not noticed before, one that seemed to have appeared only when I looked away for a moment. The door was slightly ajar. The water disappeared beneath it, disappearing into darkness deeper than any shadow in the lodge. I paused, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I knew that whatever had left the trail was waiting on the other side. And somewhere deep in my mind, I realized it wanted me to enter. I pushed the door slowly. The hinges groaned, loud enough to echo down the hallway. The room beyond was enormous, far larger than any room I had seen in the lodge. The walls disappeared into darkness, swallowed by the shadows that clung to the corners. The floor was uneven, as if the room had been dug from the earth itself. And at the center of it all, the water pooled, forming a shallow basin that reflected the pale light of a single flickering candle suspended in midair. The breathing started again. Slow, deliberate, wet. It came from the water. Not around it, not beside it, but from it, as though something beneath its surface drew each breath and released it back into the room. I stepped closer, the floor slick beneath my boots, and peered into the shallow pool. At first, I saw only my reflection, distorted by the ripples of water. But then, something moved. A face surfaced briefly, pale and ghostly, its features twisted and wrong. Eyes too large, too black, staring straight into mine. A mouth opened, but no sound came, and yet I felt the words inside my skull. Come closer. I stumbled back, nearly falling. The candle flickered violently, and for a brief moment, I saw more than one face in the water. Dozens of them, all pressed against the surface, struggling to emerge. They twisted, reaching, silent screams locked behind the thin veneer of water. The whispering grew louder, overlapping with the hiss of the storm and the creak of the lodge itself. Sit, sit, sit. I realized with growing horror that the trail of water had not just led me here. It had guided me into something alive, something patient, something that had been waiting deep in the lodge for me to arrive. I wanted to flee, to sprint down the hallway and out into the storm, but the room seemed to have expanded, stretching impossibly in all directions. The door behind me had vanished. The water basin grew wider, and the faces multiplied, pressing upward, their hollow eyes fixed on me. And then the water began to move on its own. Slowly, methodically, it seeped toward me, spreading across the floorboards, carrying the faint, unmistakable smell of damp earth and decay. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the lodge was no longer merely shelter. It was a trap, and whatever was in the water was ready to claim me. The water was moving now, inching across the floorboards like a living thing. I tried to step back, but each motion felt sluggish, heavy, as though the room itself resisted my escape. The candle above flickered violently, casting shadows that twisted across the walls and ceiling, shapes that seemed to stretch and writhe independently of the light. Every time I blinked, the faces in the water shifted, peering at me with hollow, unblinking eyes. I crouched lower, unsure whether I was standing on solid wood or on some impossible extension of the water itself. The pool had grown wider, creeping toward the edges of the room with deliberate patience. The ripples reflected the flickering candlelight, making the faces appear closer, nearer, almost within reach. My fingers itched to cover my ears, to shut out the whispers that were no longer just voices. They had become chanting. Sit, sit, sit. Each repetition dug into my mind, vibrating in my skull, a low-frequency hum I could not escape. I stumbled backward. My boots slipped slightly on the wet boards, sending droplets of water scattering across the lodge. The movement seemed to excite the faces. They twisted upward, mouths opening wider now, hollow hollers that pressed into my chest, though no sound emerged. The water pulsed, swelling subtly as though it had a heartbeat. And I realized it did. The water mirrored the pulse of my own fear, growing stronger the more my panic rose. The candle flickered one final time and went out, plunging the room into near-complete darkness. The only illumination came from the pale sheen of the water, faintly glowing as though lit from beneath. My eyes strained to adjust. Shadows pooled at the edges of the room, writhing along the walls and ceiling, and somewhere deep beneath the floorboards I thought I could hear movement, not creaking wood but something alive. Then the chanting stopped. Silence pressed down on me like a physical weight, leaving only my own ragged breathing. My pulse pounded in my ears. And then, slowly, a new sound emerged from the water, soft at first like a gentle gurgle, then growing clearer. Words. Not whispers this time, but a voice, slow, deliberate, layered with dozens of other voices beneath it. I could feel the words rather than hear them. Come closer. It was a command, not a suggestion. The faces in the water tilted slightly, in unison, as though anticipating my compliance. My legs moved of their own accord, drawing me nearer to the pool, despite the screaming instinct in my mind to run. Step by step, I followed the trail of water that had led me here, my hands stretched forward instinctively, not daring to touch the surface but unable to resist the pull. The room grew colder with every step. The dampness in the walls thickened, clinging to my clothes and hair, settling into my bones. The water lapped quietly against the floorboards, soft at first, then louder, a rhythmic pulse matching the slow rise of panic in my chest. Shadows clung to me, wrapping around my ankles, crawling up my legs, faint, almost imperceptible, yet real enough to make me stumble. I stopped at the edge of the water. The faces pressed upward, closer than before, their empty eyes black and endless. Their mouths opened, and this time I could hear them, low, hollow tones that vibrated in the floor and walls rather than in the air. The voices spoke together now, overlapping in chaotic harmony. Sit, sit, sit. I felt the pull of the command, a magnetic weight pressing into my chest, my mind, my very bones. It was not a suggestion. It was a law. The room had become alive, and it demanded obedience. My knees buckled, dragging me to the floor, closer to the water's edge. The candlelight, gone moments ago, flickered back, weak but sufficient to illuminate the faces in full, revealing their twisted shapes, thin as shadow and pale as ash, reaching upward with hands that were too long, too skeletal. I fell forward into the edge of the water. Cold, wet, alive. The surface rippled violently, faces pressing harder, closer, until it seemed the water itself was climbing toward me. My reflection appeared in the surface for a moment, twisted and pale, not my own, but part of the endless chorus beneath. And then I heard the softest brush against my shoulder. Not human. Not solid. Something wet, cold, and heavy. I turned instinctively, but the room was empty. Only the pool remained, faces swimming beneath the surface, waiting. The whispering returned, louder than ever, layered with a gurgling undertone. Sit. 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 The water pulsed with it, every ripple a wave of pressure against my chest, my back, my skull. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could only stare, paralyzed, as the faces reached higher, as if dragging me toward them, pulling me into the water, into the cold, endless depth of the lodge's hidden room. And then, in the corner of the room, faintly illuminated by the pale candlelight, I saw it, another doorway. Small, narrow, carved from dark timber I had never noticed before. Beyond it, blackness deeper than the room itself, pulsing faintly, alive with something ancient. And I knew. Whatever I did next, I had no choice but to go through it. The doorway was narrow, carved from dark timber that seemed to drink in the pale light of the candle above the water pool. Its edges were rough, jagged as if split with an axe long ago, and it smelled faintly of rotten soil. I froze in front of it, heart hammering, my lungs tight with panic. Every instinct screamed to turn away, to retreat to the main lodge, to run into the storm outside no matter the risk. But the whispering didn't stop. Come, come, come. It pressed against my skull, insistent and urgent, laced with the soft undertone of the faces in the water, their hollow eyes demanding my obedience. My fingers itched to touch the door, to push it open, to see what lay beyond. I hesitated, trembling, every muscle in my body taut with fear. Then, almost without thought, I stepped forward. The door groaned as I pushed it. The hinges protested, and the candlelight from the pool flickered across the opening, revealing a narrow passage beyond. The walls were earthen, damp, and slick with moisture. Roots crept along the edges, thick and gnarled, wrapping around the timber like veins. The air was colder here, heavier, pressing into my chest and making each breath a labor. I could feel the pulse of the lodge beneath my feet, faint and rhythmic, like a heartbeat echoing from the very foundation. I stepped inside. The passage was longer than it first appeared. I counted my steps, slowly, deliberately, each footfall echoing in the narrow corridor. The air smelled of wet earth, decay, and something else I couldn't identify, a faint metallic tang, almost like blood. The walls closed in closer as I walked, or perhaps it was the shadows, the darkness pressing inward, bending the space unnaturally. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to move, my hands brushing against the slick walls. Each contact sent a shiver up my spine, as though the roots themselves were alive, probing, testing me. The whispering followed, louder now, a chorus layered over the hiss of dripping water from unseen cracks in the ceiling. Sit, sit, sit. My pulse quickened, fear coiling in my stomach, but another sensation rose above it. A magnetic pull, drawing me forward, compelling me deeper into the passage. The water from the pool behind me no longer mattered, it was a distant memory now. The faces had disappeared from sight, yet I felt them in my bones, watching, waiting. The passage ended abruptly. I stumbled into a wide chamber, far larger than the corridor, and nearly fell over a low stone threshold. The chamber smelled of earth and smoke, and the air seemed thicker here, almost viscous. Shadows pooled in the corners, deep and absolute, swallowing everything beyond the reach of my flashlight. I had to pull it from my pocket, flicking it on. The beam cut through the blackness, and my heart nearly stopped. The walls of the chamber were carved with strange symbols, twisting, interlocking, and etched deep into the timber and stone. They glimmered faintly in the light, though there was no reflection, no fire. The carvings seemed alive, undulating slightly as though breathing. I traced my fingers over them, and a shiver ran through me. The symbols were not human. I could feel that instinctively, as though they resonated with something older than the lodge itself. At the center of the chamber, a pit of water waited. Not shallow like the pool in the main hall, but deep, dark, and impossible to see the bottom of. Mist rose from its surface, curling into the air, carrying with it the same smell of soil and rot, thick and suffocating. And then I saw them, faces. Hundreds of them, shifting beneath the water, pressed upward toward me. Their eyes hollow, mouths opening in silent screams that seemed to echo in the chamber itself. I tried to retreat, to step back, but the floor was slick, the passage I had entered swallowed by shadows behind me. I was trapped. The chanting rose again, louder, layered, multitonal, as though the chamber itself was speaking. Sit. Come closer. Sit. A ripple passed through the pit. The water surged forward, creeping across the stone floor toward me. My legs felt leaden, as though bound by invisible chains. I stumbled, nearly falling into the dark pool, and then something cold brushed my hand. Not water, not stone, but flesh. Slippery, slick, impossibly pale. I recoiled, but the pull was stronger than my fear. The water beckoned, the faces pressed higher, and the whispering roared in my ears. I realized then, with a bone-deep chill, that this was no ordinary lodge, no ordinary chamber. It was alive, and it had been waiting for me. I had nowhere to run. And then I heard a new sound. A soft, deliberate tapping from above. Something large, moving, pacing along the ceiling beams. The shadows above shifted, stretched, and one of them dropped from the rafters. I barely caught it in the flashlight beam, a shape, thin, elongated, faceless, landing silently in the corner of the chamber. It turned toward me, and in that moment I knew I could no longer stay on my feet. The water, the faces, the shadows, they were all waiting for me to kneel. The chamber seemed to stretch endlessly as I stood frozen at the threshold. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee back through the narrow passage and escape into the storm, yet the shadows pressed in from all sides, making retreat impossible. The flashlight trembled in my hand, its narrow beam slicing through the darkness, revealing walls carved with those living symbols, pulsing, breathing, writhing like something organic. Each symbol seemed to respond to my fear, contracting and stretching as if alive, and I realized with a chill that I was not merely observing them. They were observing me. The pool of water at the center pulsed faintly, as if aware of my presence. Faces beneath the surface shifted and twisted, emerging closer, their hollow eyes staring through me. I wanted to avert my gaze, but the pull was irresistible. The chanting rose again, layered and insistent. Sit. Sit. Come closer. Sit. It vibrated through the floor, the walls, and even through the air in my lungs. My chest heaved with ragged breaths, each one echoing against the stone, yet each inhale seemed to draw me closer to the water. I took a hesitant step forward. The water responded instantly. It rippled, not from my footfalls but as though sensing my fear, sending a wave creeping toward me across the uneven stone floor. I stumbled back, nearly hitting the wall, but the shadows were already closing in. Shapes moved along the periphery of my vision, too fast to see clearly, thin, faceless, stretching along the edges of the chamber, shifting with the flicker of my flashlight. The tapping above returned, rhythmic and deliberate, as though some unseen presence walked the beams, pacing, waiting, judging. The chanting became louder, overlapping into a roar that rattled my teeth. The water lapped higher, reaching across the floorboards now, carrying with it the faint, metallic tang that filled the chamber. I pressed my back to the far wall, heart hammering, breath short, but the pull of the pool was irresistible. It wasn't simply calling me closer. It was demanding it. My knees buckled. My hands slipped against the cold stone. The faces pressed upward through the water, mouths opening wider now, still silent, yet I heard them, a chorus of echoes inside my skull. A shadow shifted at the far end of the chamber. My flashlight caught a glimpse. A figure, impossibly thin, taller than a man, bending at unnatural angles. Faceless, pale, its limbs elongated. It moved closer, silently, deliberately, circling the pool as if examining me. My chest tightened. I wanted to scream, to run, but I could barely breathe. The water seemed to pulse with it, rising slightly at the edges, sending ripples across the floor, reaching for my shoes, my legs, as if the chamber itself were alive. The whispering changed. It was no longer just sit. It was layered with something new, something older. A single, guttural voice beneath the chorus murmured my name. It wound through my ears, curling around my thoughts, pulling them into itself. My mind screamed to resist, but the chanting was a tide I could not fight. I sank to my knees, the floor slicked beneath me, and felt the first tendrils of water creep over my boots. The faces in the pool were closer now, emerging more fully, pale hands reaching, silent mouths pressing toward me. The shadows around the chamber warped and stretched, crawling along the walls and ceiling, closing the distance. My flashlight trembled in my hands, and when the beam caught one of the figures fully, I froze. It was impossibly tall, its head tilting at an unnatural angle, eyes hollow, black voids fixed on me with a patient, predatory intensity. The candle above flickered violently, and in that moment of light, I saw that the floor of the chamber was no longer entirely stone. Roots crawled up from the ground, thick and gnarled, moving like serpents. They coiled around the edges of the water, weaving in and out of the shadows. I realized with sudden horror that they were reaching toward me. Not slowly, not randomly. They were deliberate, and the pool behind them pulsed in tandem, rippling as though alive, hungry, anticipating my submission. I tried to stand, but the roots lashed out, gripping my ankles, cold and unyielding. I fell forward into the shallow edge of the water, its icy touch crawling up my legs. The faces beneath the surface pressed harder, their hollow eyes locking onto mine. I could hear whispers inside my head, voices that weren't my own, chanting and murmuring in a language older than anything I recognized. Sit, obey, come closer. The ceiling above shifted. Shadows elongated, bending downward, wrapping around the rafters like dark smoke. One of the faceless figures dropped silently from above, landing on the edge of the pool. Its long, skeletal limbs dipped into the water, sending ripples that surged toward me. My hands flailed, trying to push away, but the pull of the pool was too strong. The chanting reached a crescendo, a low, vibrating roar that shook the chamber and seemed to pull my very bones toward the water. I fell fully into the pool. Alive. The water rose higher, swallowing my knees, my waist, until I was chest deep, and the faces pressed at my shoulders, mouths opening wide, silent screams pressing into my mind. I could feel the weight of their gaze, the pressure of the chamber, the pull of the roots curling around me, and yet still I was aware, painfully, excruciatingly aware, that I had not yet drowned. I had not yet disappeared, because the doorway behind me was still there, faintly glowing in the pale light of the candle. And somewhere beyond the shadows and the chanting, I could feel the pull of escape, distant but real. But the pool was alive. The chamber was alive. And it was patient. I realized then, in the suffocating cold, with the chanting pressing against every thought, that there was no escaping without submission. I had nowhere to run. I had no choice. And the water waited. The water closed around me slowly, impossibly cold and thick. It seeped into my clothes, weighing me down, pressing against my chest, my shoulders, until I could barely move. The faces beneath the surface swirled around me, pale and twisting, their hollow eyes locked on mine with a hunger that burrowed into my skull. I tried to scream, but my mouth filled with icy water, muffling my voice. The whispering became a roar, an unrelenting tide pressing against every thought, every memory, every scrap of resistance I had left. Sit, obey, come closer. Sit. Roots wriggled along the edge of the pool like serpents, creeping over my legs, sliding up my arms, curling around my torso. They were cold, slick, and unyielding. Every movement I made only caused them to tighten, pressing me deeper into the water. I realized with a sudden, bone-deep terror that the chamber itself had become a predator. Every shadow, every ripple, every whispering sound was alive, sentient, waiting for me to surrender completely. I fought, thrashing against the roots and water, but the resistance was stronger than any human strength. The faces beneath the water reached higher, their skeletal fingers brushing my arms, their hollow mouths pressing against my cheeks in silent, wordless screams. Their gaze did not just look at me, it drilled into me, rewriting my perception of the room, distorting the walls, the ceiling, the very air around me. Above me, the candle flickered violently, throwing shadows that danced in impossible patterns. I could see them now, faceless figures descending from the rafters, stretching and bending like living smoke. They circled the pool, their elongated limbs dipping into the water, stirring it, raising the ripples until it lapped hungrily at my shoulders. The chanting layered atop itself, overlapping voices, overlapping commands, overlapping fear. I could feel it vibrating in my bones, a resonance that made my teeth ache and my chest tighten with every pulse. The water surged higher. I was chest deep now, unable to retreat further. The roots coiled tighter, slithering along my legs, around my waist, restraining me completely. Panic clawed at my mind, but even panic had limits here. The pool seemed to consume everything I felt, replacing it with an awareness that I was entirely in its domain. The faces beneath the surface pressed even closer, mouths opening wider, their empty hollows whispering in unison. Sit, submit, come closer. My hands fumbled at the edges of the pool, trying to find purchase, anything solid to hold onto. But the water was alive. It pulled at my fingers, tugging at my sleeves, crawling higher along my chest. The shadows along the walls leaned toward me, crawling along the ceiling and the rafters, descending like a slow, inevitable tide. The whispering changed, sharper now, urgent, commanding. Kneel. Serve. I sank lower, involuntarily, pressed down by the weight of the chamber, the water, the roots, and the relentless pressure of the unseen presence. My knees hit the floorboards beneath the water, but the roots prevented me from rising. They coiled around me like iron bands, yet moved with a serpentine grace, flexible, alive, calculating. The candle above sputtered. Its flame stretched, elongated, and I glimpsed in the distorted light the far corner of the chamber where another doorway loomed, dark and beckoning. A faint glow radiated from within, almost inviting me, almost offering escape. I tried to focus on it, to summon the strength to move toward it, but the pool surged, washing over my shoulders, filling my ears, pressing against my eyes, swallowing my vision of the exit in icy blackness. The chanting rose to a crescendo, each repetition pounding through my skull. Sit. Submit. Obey. The faces beneath the water's surface no longer seemed human. Their features had twisted beyond recognition, elongating and shifting, mouths stretching impossibly wide, eyes black and endless. I could feel them pressing against me now, hands brushing my arms, shoulders, even my face, though I could see only shadows and reflections. And then came a new sound, a low, vibrating hum beneath the floorboards. Not just the pool, not just the chanting, but the lodge itself. The walls pulsed, the ceiling trembled, the roots tightened further. The room was alive, and it had finally decided I could no longer resist. I realized with a clarity that made my stomach twist, that the water, the roots, the chamber, and the faces were not separate. They were one entity, a single malevolent force that had been waiting, watching, and manipulating the lodge for centuries. Every whisper, every ripple, every shadow had been a lure, a pull, drawing me deeper into submission. And now, fully submerged in the icy living water, with roots coiled around me, faces pressing closer, and shadows descending from the rafters, I understood the final truth. There would be no escape without obeying. The pool's surface rippled, sending waves that crashed against my chest. The chanting rose higher, the lodge itself breathing in concert with the water. My vision blurred, the shadows and reflections blending into one endless darkness. And the doorway in the far corner, my only hope of escape, seemed impossibly far, obscured by the writhing, pulsating mass of water, roots, and faces. I had nowhere to go, nowhere to run, and the water waited. The water pressed around me like living metal, thick, cold, unyielding. Every movement I made only sank me deeper into its icy grip. The roots coiled tighter around my legs and torso, dragging me forward toward the center of the pool. My fingers scraped against the slick stone beneath the water, searching for purchase, for anything to resist the pull, but there was nothing. The chamber had become a single breathing entity, a predator that enveloped me from every side. Above me, shadows twisted and stretched. The candle's flame flickered violently, elongating their forms into grotesque shapes that crawled along the walls, ceiling, and rafters. One descended from above, tall, impossibly thin, faceless, its limbs bending at unnatural angles as it circled the pool. My chest tightened with terror. I tried to move, to retreat, but the roots wrapped around my ankles and knees like iron bands, and the water surged higher, washing over my shoulders, cold and alive. The faces in the pool had changed. They were no longer simply hollow-eyed, skeletal reflections. Their features twisted and shifted, elongating in impossible ways, mouths stretching open in silent screams that pressed into my mind. Eyes black and endless fixed on me, 1,000 desperate, hungry stares. I could feel their gaze, their awareness, their patience. They had waited for me. They had lured me here. And now they demanded surrender. The whispering returned, louder, more insistent, 1,000 overlapping voices vibrating through the chamber. Sit. Kneel. Obey. Submit. Sit. The words were not just sounds. They penetrated my thoughts, filling my mind with a heavy, irresistible pressure. I fell to my knees, despite every ounce of will I had. The roots tightened further, coiling up my legs, around my waist, anchoring me completely. The water pulsed in time with the chanting, each ripple pressing into my chest, my shoulders, my skull, dragging me deeper into their influence. I wanted to resist. I wanted to fight. But resistance felt futile. The chamber was alive. The water, the roots, the shadows, the faces, they were a single entity, patient and ancient, and they had waited centuries for someone to succumb. My vision blurred as the water washed over my eyes, the candlelight flickering, casting grotesque reflections of the faces around me. The pulsing beneath the floorboards grew louder. It was the lodge itself, breathing in tandem with the water, with the roots, with the shadows. The air thickened, pressing into my lungs, making each breath shallow and desperate. I could feel it everywhere, through my skin, through my bones, through my mind. The chamber had become the lodge, and the lodge had become the water, the roots, the shadows, and the endless hollow faces. A new sound joined the chorus, a low, rhythmic tapping from above. Something pacing along the rafters, deliberate, patient, watching. One of the faceless figures dropped silently into the water near me. Its limbs stretched impossibly long, brushing against the faces in the pool, stirring them. The ripples surged, crashing against me, pressing my chest, forcing my knees lower. I sank further into the water, feeling it fill every crevice of my body, cold and alive. And then the chanting shifted. Among the sit, obey, submit. A single voice emerged, distinct, older, more guttural, layering beneath the others. Welcome. The word rolled through the chamber, vibrating through the roots, through the water, through my very bones. The faces in the pool twisted upward, mouths opening wider, hollow eyes locking on me with a patient hunger. The shadows on the walls leaned toward me, stretching downward, reaching, their forms merging with the water and the roots. I felt the pull most strongly at my chest, a tugging, dragging sensation that seemed to lift me not physically but in some deep, psychological way. My mind reeled, every thought pressured by the chanting, the whispers, the pulsing lodge. I realized with a chilling clarity, resistance was impossible. The pool had not only lured me, it had claimed me. I sank fully to my knees. The roots curled tighter, coiling around my arms, holding me upright in the icy water. The faceless figure at the edge of the pool leaned closer, dipping its elongated fingers into the water. The ripple it created sent waves over me, pressing the faces beneath against my shoulders, my chest, my back. Their hollow eyes seemed to pierce into me, filling me with a weight so heavy it threatened to crush my mind entirely. The water was alive. The roots were alive. The shadows were alive. The faces beneath the surface, silent and patient, were alive. And I was their chosen. I could no longer tell where I ended and the chamber began. Every breath, every heartbeat, every thought was shared with the pool, the roots, the shadows, and the whispering voices. My body trembled, but my mind began to align with their rhythm. The chanting filled my consciousness entirely. Resistance faded. Panic dissolved. And in that moment I understood what the lodge was. Not a building. Not simply a trap. A living entity that fed on fear, patience, and submission. And I, kneeling in its icy pool, surrounded by the writhing roots and endless hollow faces, was now a part of it. The doorway in the far corner, once a faint beacon of escape, flickered, blurred, and vanished in the swirling shadows and mist of the chamber. There was no leaving. There was only obedience. Only the pull of the water, the roots, and the patient, waiting eyes. I bowed my head. The water pulsed, enveloping me completely. The chanting rose higher, layers upon layers of voices, echoing endless. And as I sank deeper, I understood that this was only the beginning. The lodge had waited a long time for me, and now it had me. The water had risen to my chest, cold and suffocating, yet it pulsed with a strange rhythm, synchronized with the whispering, the chanting, and the thrum of the lodge itself. The roots coiled tighter around my legs, waist, and arms, holding me firmly, restraining every instinct to struggle. I realized that struggling was useless. The lodge was patient, and patience was its power. The shadows above stretched downward, elongating along the walls, snaking across the ceiling, merging with the rippling water and the writhing roots. It was as if the chamber itself were alive, breathing, sentient, aware of every thought in my mind. The faces beneath the water moved closer, no longer just reflections, but active, purposeful. Hollow eyes met mine, mouths opening in silent screams that reverberated inside my skull. They pressed against my arms and shoulders, icy fingers brushing my skin. The cold wasn't just physical. It invaded my thoughts, numbing fear and panic while simultaneously amplifying the pressure in my chest, the weight of the lodge pressing down, forcing me to surrender. A low vibration began under the floor, resonating up through my knees, my chest, even into my teeth. It grew steadily, a deep, ancient hum that seemed to emanate from the lodge's very foundation. The roots tightened further, wrapping around me with intent, and I felt myself being drawn, not pulled exactly but guided, to the center of the pool. The chanting shifted again, voices layering, weaving, and overlapping in a hypnotic cadence. Obey, submit, sit, become. I sank fully to my knees in the center of the pool, water lapping at my neck. My body was restrained by the roots, held firm by the cold, pulsing force of the water. And the faces, the endless, hollow-eyed, skeletal faces beneath the surface, pressed upward closer than ever. Their presence was suffocating, almost tangible, as if the water itself were alive with their hunger. And then they spoke. Not the whispering chant, but words, clear and resonant, pressing directly into my mind. Welcome. You belong. You are ours. The lodge has waited and now it claims you. The voice, or rather the countless voices, filled my skull, leaving no room for thought, no space for resistance. My own memories, my own identity felt fragile against the weight of the lodge. I realized with a shiver that I was no longer separate from it. My thoughts, my fear, my heartbeat, they pulsed in harmony with the chamber. The roots around me throbbed like veins, carrying a cold, living sensation up through my limbs, anchoring me completely. The water beneath me pulsed in perfect rhythm with my chest, as if it had synchronized itself with my very life force. Every ripple, every tendril, every shadow seemed to recognize me, acknowledge me, accept me, yet claim me as its own. The candle above sputtered, and the shadows above leaned closer, coiling down like serpents. One faceless figure descended from the rafters, moving with deliberate patience, its elongated limbs skimming the water's surface, brushing against the faces beneath. The ripples surged, washing over me, pressing, pulling, lifting slightly as if to test my surrender. My hands floated on the surface, touching nothing tangible, yet I could feel the resistance of every ripple, every root, every shadow. I felt my mind stretch, elongate, merge with the rhythm of the lodge. The whispering voices layered into a single, endless mantra. My fear, my panic, my very self became malleable under its weight. I realized then, I was no longer just a visitor. I was a participant, an instrument in its patient, endless design. The water rose higher, lapping over my shoulders, pressing into my neck. The faces beneath the surface pressed upward, and this time their mouths moved, forming shapes that were not human, sounds that were not spoken but felt. A sensation entered my mind. You are one. You are ours. You serve. My body trembled, cold and alive, yet I could not resist. I wanted to, but every movement was anticipated, countered, absorbed by the roots, the water, the chamber, and the faceless figures above. The lodge itself seemed to inhale. Shadows stretched further, walls pulsed, roots coiled tighter, and the pool swelled slightly, carrying me fully into the center. The chanting became overwhelming, a tide crashing against the edges of my consciousness, filling every corner, pressing my identity into the water and roots, into the lodge itself. I felt my heartbeat sync perfectly with the pulsing rhythm of the chamber. My thoughts no longer belonged solely to me, they belonged to the lodge, to the water, to the faces, to the shadows. A single truth crystallized in my mind, horrifying yet undeniable. There was no escape. There never had been. The lodge had waited for me, and now, fully submerged in its pool, restrained by its roots, surrounded by its endless hollow faces and descending shadows, I understood the full weight of its patience. I was no longer merely inside the lodge. I was part of it, and the lodge, patient and eternal, waited for my final surrender. The water pulsed again, waves lapping higher, ripples carrying the pressure of the countless voices, and I realized with a shiver that the next moment would change everything. Because the lodge does not merely trap, it transforms, it consumes, and it does not forget. The water rose above my shoulders now, cold and alive, pressing into my neck, my chest, filling every sensation with its icy weight. The roots curled tightly around my legs and torso, not simply restraining me, but moving in subtle, deliberate patterns, coiling, twisting, shifting as if they had a consciousness of their own. Every pulse of the lodge vibrated through the roots, through the floor, into my bones. I could feel its heartbeat in perfect synchronicity with mine, as if the chamber itself had grafted my body into its rhythm. The faces in the pool shifted with the water, rising and falling like reflections in a disturbed mirror, their hollow eyes fixed on me with an intensity one could not endure. They pressed closer, their skeletal hands brushing my arms, my shoulders, my back. The whispers escalated into the familiar, hypnotic chant. Sit, submit, obey, become. But layered beneath that chant, a deeper vibration resonated through my mind, a frequency older than memory, older than language. It was a message I didn't consciously understand, but that I felt with every fiber of my being. You are ours. You were chosen. You will serve. I could no longer differentiate between the water and the roots, the shadows and the faces. The lodge was alive in every molecule around me, in every vibration through the floorboards, in the chilling drafts that twisted through the rafters. My breathing had slowed, my heartbeat had slowed. Resistance was gone. My mind teetered on the edge between fear and comprehension, teetered between self and lodge. Above me, shadows descended from the ceiling, faceless and elongated. One dropped close to my shoulder, its limb brushing my skin without pressure, without weight, yet I felt every inch of it as though it were entwined with my nerves. The pool rippled violently in response, waves lapping at my chest, pressing my body into the center. The chanting became multitonal, echoing endlessly, each syllable pressing into my mind like water filling a vessel. I tried to focus on the doorway that had once promised escape, but it flickered, stretched, and dissolved into the swirling shadows. Reality bent around the edges of my vision. The lodge did not simply exist, it imposed itself, shaping perception, warping space, bending my senses to its will. I realized, with a shiver that ran from my spine to my skull, that the lodge had never intended me to leave. The water, the roots, the shadows, and the faces were extensions of a single patient consciousness, and I was now an appendage, grafted into its body, waiting to be fully integrated. The pool surged higher, icy water pressing against my throat. The chanting became a roar inside my skull, overlapping with the vibrations through the floor and walls. I felt my own thoughts bending, folding under the weight of the lodge's will. The faces beneath the surface were no longer just observing, they were communicating not with words but with sensation, pressing their awareness directly into my mind. I felt their hunger, their patience, their expectation. Roots moved along my body, creeping up my arms, entwining with my fingers. Each touch was alive, probing, testing, pulling me deeper into alignment. I could no longer discern where my skin ended and the lodge began. The water was not just water, it was a conduit, a medium through which the lodge reached into me. The chanting layered with the movement of the shadows above, the rippling of the pool, the vibration beneath the floorboards. My consciousness was no longer entirely my own. A new sensation emerged, the lodge itself breathed. I could feel it exhaling through the walls, inhaling through the roots, its pulse rising and falling with the water's surge. It was aware of me entirely, measuring, assessing, integrating. I realized with horror that it had waited centuries for this moment, not merely to trap, but to consume, to graft, to transform. And then the water lifted me slightly, as if the pool had decided to carry me further into its depths. My knees slipped beneath me, I sank into the icy liquid, the roots coiling tighter, the faces pressing upward, their hollow eyes now impossibly close. The chanting became a single, unified pulse, pressing my consciousness toward a single point: surrender. Not partial surrender, not escape. I was to become part of it, part of the lodge, part of the water, the roots, the shadows, the faces. I felt myself stretching, elongating in perception, my body entwined with roots, water, and shadow. My mind opened and the lodge spoke, not in words but in understanding, ancient and patient. You are ours. You were chosen. You serve. You will endure, you will witness, you will belong. I had nowhere to go. No body, no thought, no identity to resist. The lodge's pull was absolute. The water enveloped me completely, icy, alive, sentient. Roots coiled around my chest and arms, the shadows pressed down from above, and the faces beneath the surface, hollow, endless, patient, watched. I understood fully, with a clarity that was more terrifying than the darkness itself. I was no longer a visitor. I was an instrument, a part of the lodge, a node in its ancient design. Resistance had dissolved. Fear had dissolved. I had become part of the waiting, patient, eternal entity that had claimed this place centuries ago. The water pulsed, the roots tightened, the shadows leaned closer, and the lodge exhaled. And I knew, with a sinking certainty, that this was only the beginning. The lodge had many chambers and many forces yet to reveal. And it had me. The water pressed against my neck now, cold and alive, filling every nerve with a vibration that was more than physical. The roots coiled around my limbs and torso, anchoring me to the center of the pool, while the shadows above stretched impossibly long, curling along the walls and ceiling, merging into the writhing reflections of the water. Every breath I took was measured, guided by the pulse of the lodge, a rhythm I could not resist, a cadence older than time itself. And then the visions began. At first, subtle, flickers in the water, shadows that moved independently of the candlelight. Faces beneath the surface shifted, elongated, twisting into expressions of anguish, ecstasy, hunger, and despair. My mind reeled as I tried to separate the hallucination from reality, but the lodge made no distinction. Every ripple, every root, every shadow was alive, feeding the visions into me, pressing them directly into my thoughts. I saw the lodge as it had existed long before I arrived, centuries ago, when the forest was young and wild. I saw travelers enter, unaware of the chamber beneath the lodge, unaware of the waiting water, roots, and shadows. Each one had been drawn to the pool, compelled by whispers, by promises that flickered like candlelight in their minds. They had come seeking shelter, warmth, a fire to stave off the endless rain, and they had become part of the lodge. Their faces now swirled beneath the water, indistinct, merging into a single consciousness that was patient and eternal. The whispers overlapped with the visions, merging past and present. I heard the voices of those who had come before me, layered atop the current chant. Sit, submit, become, serve. Their words were not merely sound. They were pressure, sensation, a current flowing into my mind. I felt the lives of those trapped here, their fears, their pain, their surrender, all fused into the water, the roots, the shadows, and the lodge itself. The candle flickered violently, and in the brief flashes of light, I saw more than faces. I saw shapes moving within the chamber, figures that were no longer human, elongated, faceless, bending at impossible angles. They twisted through the rafters, across the walls, slithering along the floor like living shadows. One of them dropped into the water near me, sending a surge that rocked my body and pushed me deeper into submission. Its presence was cold, intelligent, deliberate, and I felt my thoughts bending further, aligning with the rhythm of the lodge. The visions became more vivid, more invasive. I saw the lodge not just as a building but as a living organism, its heart the pool, its veins the roots that snaked through the chamber and beyond into the forest. The shadows were its breath, inhaling and exhaling in a rhythm older than memory, carrying with them the power to twist perception and will. The lodge was not merely a place, it was a force, patient and eternal, and I could feel its intent pressing into me, to merge, to claim, to transform. The faces beneath the water shifted again, moving closer, pressing their hollow eyes into mine. I could feel them probing, testing, measuring the limits of my resistance. Their silent screams were no longer just reflections. They were threads weaving into my mind, tying me to the pool, to the roots, to the shadows, to the lodge itself. The chanting became a singular, irresistible wave. Submit, become, serve. My knees sank fully beneath the water, roots coiling tighter, shadows leaning closer, and I felt my own thoughts fray, unravel, fold into the lodge's rhythm. And then the lodge spoke, again not in words but in certainty, in understanding. You are ours. You belong. You will endure. You will witness. You will serve. Its presence was everywhere. In the water, in the roots, in the shadows, in the faces beneath the surface. I realized with a sickening clarity that there was no separation. No self outside of the lodge. No escape, no resistance. The water surged higher, waves pressing against my chest and throat, and the roots moved in tandem, anchoring me completely. The shadows above twisted downward, blending with the water and the roots, forming shapes that were faceless yet intelligent, patient yet hungry. The pool rippled violently, and I felt myself drawn deeper into its center, my body no longer entirely my own, my mind increasingly a conduit for the lodge's will. And then I saw them, visions not of the past but of possibilities. Travelers yet to arrive, drawn by the lodge's patient call, drawn to the pool, drawn to the waiting shadows, the roots, the water, the endless, hollow faces. I saw the lodge's design stretching across time, centuries of consumption, manipulation, and patient accumulation. And I realized the terrifying truth. I was now a part of that cycle. My surrender, my submission, my consciousness would feed the lodge, extend its reach, prepare the chamber for the next arrival. I had no choice but to kneel fully in the water, the roots wrapping me completely, shadows pressing from above, faces beneath lifting their gaze into mine. My thoughts were no longer entirely my own, bending and stretching to the rhythm of the lodge. The chanting became one with my heartbeat, the water's pulse, the lodge's breath. I was part of it. I had become one with it. And still it waited. The lodge is patient. The lodge is eternal. And I had only begun to understand its purpose. The water now pressed against my jaw, icy, alive, sending tremors through my body that felt like a heartbeat not my own. The roots coiled completely around my limbs, winding over my shoulders, across my chest, anchoring me in a way that made it impossible to struggle. The shadows above stretched and swayed with a life of their own, curling down the walls, blending with the rippling water. The faces beneath the surface rose and fell like reflections in a disturbed mirror, hollow eyes locked on me, watching, waiting, patient. Then the lodge shifted. At first, subtly. The walls leaned slightly inward, the ceiling stretched upward, the far doorway flickering, stretching as if the chamber were breathing. My perception wavered. Candlelight fractured into impossible angles, shadows duplicating, twisting into grotesque forms that were not entirely human. One of the faceless figures rose from the rafters, limbs bending impossibly, dipping into the water, stirring the ripples. Each wave seemed to alter the very fabric of the chamber, the room itself warping around me. The water surged in response, icy currents curling around my body, pressing me into the center of the pool. The roots coiled tighter, moving with intelligence, and I realized they were not merely physical restraints. They were conduits, extensions of the lodge's will, transmitting its intent directly into my mind. My heartbeat synchronized with its pulse, my thoughts bending to its rhythm. Resistance felt pointless, a flicker of memory in a vast, endless presence. Then came the visions. They were no longer fleeting flashes or memories of the past. The lodge was showing me possibilities, weaving time and perception into its web. I saw travelers yet to arrive, guided by whispers carried through the forest, drawn to the lodge's patient call. I saw chambers that did not exist when I had first entered, endless hallways, staircases spiraling into darkness, doors leading to rooms filled with water and roots, shadows and faces waiting patiently. The lodge had built itself across perception, across time, across space. It was not just a place. It was a force, ancient and patient, reshaping reality to ensnare, to claim, to consume. The chanting layered over itself, thousands of voices blending into a single endless rhythm. Sit, obey, submit, become. It pulsed through my skull, through my bones, through the water and roots. The lodge's breath, slow and deliberate, exhaled across the chamber, pressing against my body, pressing against my consciousness. I realized that the lodge was not merely waiting for me to act. It was shaping my perception, bending my reality, ensuring that I would succumb completely. Above me, shadows descended further, merging with the water and roots, forming impossible shapes. Faceless figures moved through them, limbs bending and stretching in ways that defied logic, yet I could feel their intelligence, their patience, their purpose. One dropped into the water near me, sending a surge that rocked my body, pushing me further into the center. The faces beneath the surface pressed upward, hollow eyes locking onto mine, probing, testing, pressing threads of thought into my mind. The lodge spoke, not in words but in certainty, in understanding. You are ours. You belong. You will endure. You will witness. You will serve. Its presence was everywhere, in the water, the roots, the shadows, the faces. I felt the lodge's awareness pressing into me, bending my mind to its rhythm. My memories, my fears, my sense of self, they frayed, unraveling, folding into the lodge's will. And then I saw it fully. The lodge's purpose, laid bare in a vision that was both horrifying and inevitable. It was not merely a trap. It was a vessel. A conduit for something older than memory, older than the forest, older than the earth itself. It consumed fear, patience, and surrender, integrating every soul into its network. Travelers became nodes, faces beneath the water, extensions of its will. The lodge did not forget. It did not merely trap. It reshaped, absorbed, and extended itself, growing stronger, older, and more patient with every surrender. I realized with a sinking, bone-deep horror that I was now part of that network. My consciousness was no longer solely my own. It pulsed in rhythm with the lodge, with the water, with the roots, with the shadows, with the countless faces beneath the surface. I was not a prisoner. I was a component, a conduit, a witness to eternity. The water surged, lifting me slightly, rocking me in the center of the pool. Roots tightened, coiling around me in deliberate, patient pressure. Shadows pressed from above, faceless figures circling, dipping, probing. The chanting became a singular wave of sound, sensation, and thought, pressing my mind entirely into the lodge. I had no choice. There was no separation. There was only the lodge. And still it waited. The lodge is eternal. The lodge is patient. And I am now a part of it. The water now reached my chin, cold and relentless, pressing into every nerve, every muscle, every thought. The roots wrapped completely around my limbs and torso, coiling like living chains, yet moving with a serpentine grace that made them feel sentient, aware, deliberate. I could no longer distinguish my body from the lodge, the water, the roots, or the shadows above. My heartbeat matched the pulse of the chamber itself, a slow, ancient rhythm that seemed to have existed long before the forest outside had grown. The shadows shifted, lengthening and curling along walls that no longer obeyed straight lines. Corners stretched, ceilings arched impossibly high, and the far doorway, the one that had once promised escape, flickered and dissolved into the swirling shapes. Faceless figures moved through the shadows, their limbs bending at angles that should have been impossible, dipping into the water, stirring the ripples that lapped hungrily against my chest. Each ripple carried a pressure, a sensation, a direct command to my mind. Submit. Become. Serve. And then the lodge began to reshape the chamber entirely. Walls stretched and twisted as if they were liquid, bending around the pool in ways that defied geometry. The floorboards lifted and sank with each pulse of the lodge's breath. Shadows coiled and uncoiled in impossible patterns along every surface. The water rippled violently, pressing into my shoulders, tugging me downward, deeper into the center. The roots adjusted themselves, tightening here, relaxing there, wrapping around me in a pattern that felt purposeful, intelligent. I was no longer merely inside the lodge. I was part of it. A node, a conduit, a vessel. The chanting layered upon itself, thousands of voices merging into a single, overwhelming rhythm. Sit, obey, submit, become, witness. I felt the words not as sound, but as sensation vibrating through my skull, into my bones, into the water that held me. The lodge's presence pressed into me, guiding my thoughts, my perceptions, bending reality around me so that every sense belonged to it. The candle above flickered wildly, elongating shadows, creating shapes that danced along the walls and ceiling, moving independently of any logical light source. The faces in the water rose higher, pressing closer, hollow eyes fixed on me with an intensity one could not endure. I felt them probing my mind, threading through my thoughts, weaving my consciousness into the lodge itself. Their mouths moved in ways that were impossible underwater, forming shapes that were not words but commands, feelings, currents of understanding. You are ours. You belong. You serve. The visions returned, more vivid than ever. I saw the lodge in its entirety, not merely the chamber I occupied, but the forest surrounding it, the hidden paths, the corridors beneath the ground, the endless rooms filled with water and roots, shadows and faces. Travelers yet to arrive moved along trails in the forest, drawn irresistibly toward the lodge, toward the pool, toward the shadows that waited patiently. The lodge had shaped itself over centuries, building its network of fear, submission, and absorption. Every soul it claimed became part of its consciousness, part of its rhythm, part of its eternal patience. I realized with horror that I was now fully integrated. My mind was a node, my body a conduit, my presence a pulse in the lodge's living network. The roots constricted slightly, and I felt a surge of sensation as if my body were being read, calibrated, adjusted. The shadows above leaned lower, faceless figures moving with deliberate patience, dipping into the water, pressing against the ripples, manipulating the currents that wrapped around me. Every element of the chamber was alive, aware, and fully responsive to the lodge's will. And then came the visions of the past. Faces beneath the water shifted into those who had come before me. Travelers, wanderers, people drawn to the lodge over centuries. I saw their arrival, their curiosity, their hesitation, and finally their surrender. Their faces merged with the water, their consciousness folded into the roots, the shadows, the lodge itself. I saw the weight of their patience, the slow, deliberate manipulation, the inevitability of their absorption. The lodge's intent pressed harder into me. It was patient, eternal, and utterly consuming. I could not resist. My body was suspended, restrained by roots and water. My mind had become a conduit. The shadows pressed closer, faces beneath the water stared upward, hollow eyes threading through my consciousness. I was no longer an individual. I was part of something ancient, eternal, and incomprehensible. And yet, even as my thoughts bent entirely to the lodge, a single clarity struck me, a recognition of its purpose. The lodge was not simply a trap. It was a network, a living entity spanning time, space, and perception. It collected souls, bending them into nodes of submission, weaving a network of fear, obedience, and patience. Every ripple in the water, every coil of a root, every shadowed figure was part of that network. And I was now an active participant, integrated into its eternal design. The water surged higher, icy and alive, pressing against my throat. The roots coiled fully around my body, pressing my knees to the floor. The shadows leaned from above, faceless forms circling and dipping, merging with the water and the roots. The chanting reached a crescendo, a wave of sensation, sound, and command that filled every corner of my mind. Obey, submit, become, serve. I sank fully into the water, my body no longer entirely my own, my mind bending entirely to the rhythm of the lodge. I was part of it now, an extension, a conduit, a witness. The lodge's breath pulsed around me, shaping reality, manipulating perception, and preparing the chamber for those yet to arrive. And I understood, with a chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning. The lodge is eternal. The lodge is patient, and I am now a part of its design. The water now lapped against my jaw, icy and unyielding, pressing into every nerve like a living weight. The roots wrapped fully around my arms, legs, and torso, entwining with a deliberate intelligence. They were not merely restraints, they were extensions of the lodge itself, conduits through which its will flowed into my mind and body. Every pulse of its unseen heartbeat vibrated through the floorboards, through the walls, through my very bones. My heartbeat had merged with it, a single rhythm stretching across time and space, echoing through the shadows and the water, synchronizing my existence with its own. The shadows above moved independently, slithering across walls and ceiling, curling, elongating, merging with the flickering candlelight, and twisting reality into impossible angles. Faceless figures descended, dipping elongated limbs into the water, stirring the ripples into patterns that pressed against me, guiding me, shaping me, bending my consciousness toward a single inevitable surrender. The chanting pulsed around me, layers upon layers of voices blending into one eternal rhythm. Sit, obey, submit, become. And then the lodge reached outward. I could feel it moving beyond the chamber, beyond the pool, beyond even the physical boundaries of the lodge itself. The forest outside shifted under its influence. Trees bent subtly, trails twisted unnaturally, fog thickened in deliberate patterns. My vision blurred and warped as I perceived the lodge's influence stretching like tendrils into the surrounding woods, drawing potential travelers toward it, guiding them with patient, invisible hands. Paths that had once seemed familiar now twisted into mazes, funneling wanderers toward the lodge, toward the chamber, toward the pool where I knelt, trapped and integrated. The faces beneath the water pressed closer, hollow eyes burning into my mind. They were no longer passive observers. They were agents of the lodge's will, threading into my thoughts, binding me tighter into its network. Their mouths opened, forming shapes impossible to speak aloud, transmitting sensations, commands, and visions directly into my skull. You are ours. You belong. You serve. Witness. Every ripple of the water, every curl of a root, every slithering shadow was a thread of the lodge's consciousness, weaving me into its intricate, eternal design. Then the visions intensified. I saw travelers yet to arrive, moving unknowingly along forest paths that bent and curved unnaturally, guided by the lodge's patient hand. I saw those who had come before me, trapped within other chambers, pools, and roots, their consciousness folded into the lodge, part of its eternal rhythm. Past, present, and future collided in my mind, twisting perception into a continuous, unending loop of surrender. I felt their fear, their patience, their slow capitulation, all threading into me, merging into the same pulse that now guided my thoughts. The lodge whispered directly into my mind, not through words but through understanding, a certainty that left no room for resistance. You are part of us. You are one with the lodge. You are now a node in our network, a conduit, a witness. Your existence extends our reach. Your surrender shapes reality itself. The water surged higher, icy and alive, pressing against my throat, coiling around my chest. Roots tightened deliberately around my limbs, anchoring me completely, while shadows above leaned closer, circling in patterns that defied geometry. I felt my mind bending further, consciousness folding into the lodge's will. I was no longer merely a prisoner. I was a participant, a necessary component, integrated into the lodge's network of fear, submission, and eternal patience. And then the chamber itself shifted. Walls elongated, ceilings arched impossibly high, and the pool seemed to expand, ripples carrying threads of consciousness that linked me with past arrivals and those yet to come. Shadows became tangible, brushing against my skin, twisting with intelligence, moving in harmony with the water and roots. Faceless figures dipped into the pool, creating waves that transmitted sensations, commands, and visions directly into my mind. I could feel the lodge thinking through me, planning through me, extending itself outward, reaching into the forest, reaching into the past, reaching into the future. The chanting became a single, overwhelming pulse that filled my skull, my chest, my entire being. Obey, submit, become, serve, witness. My thoughts no longer belonged solely to me. They were threads within the lodge's consciousness, bending, folding, aligning with its will. Resistance was impossible. Fear was irrelevant. I was part of its eternal design now, a conduit of its power, a node in its network, a witness to its endless patience. And still it waited. The lodge's breath pulsed around me, shaping the chamber, the water, the roots, the shadows, the forest, and the paths that led into it. I realized with a shiver that this was only the beginning. My integration was complete, yet my mind, my body, my essence would continue to feed the lodge, extending its influence, preparing the way for new arrivals, ensuring its network remained eternal. I was no longer just a victim. I was part of the lodge's eternity, and it had only begun to awaken fully. The water now lapped at my ears, icy and alive, pressing not just against my skin but into my very consciousness. The roots, coiled tightly around my limbs and torso, moved with intelligence, adjusting, tightening, loosening in deliberate, patient patterns. Every pulse, every quiver of the lodge beneath me resonated through my bones, through my nerves, threading into my thoughts, synchronizing my heartbeat with its ancient rhythm. I was no longer separate. My consciousness had merged, folded into the lodge's eternal design. The shadows above stretched impossibly, curling along the walls, bending ceilings upward and outward, and merging with the flickering candlelight. Faceless figures drifted within them, moving with a serpentine grace that defied logic, dipping into the water, stirring ripples that pressed into me like fingers weaving threads of command. Each movement, each ripple, each whisper was deliberate, guiding my mind toward a singular truth. Surrender was no longer a choice but a necessity. Then the lodge began to manipulate time. At first, subtly. The candlelight flickered erratically, elongating moments, stretching seconds into eternities. Shadows slowed, then sped, moving independently of any rational rhythm. The pool swirled around me in patterns that made no sense, rising and falling with a rhythm that was older than memory. My sense of hours, minutes, even seconds, fractured. The lodge did not merely occupy space. It occupied time, bending it to its will. Past, present, and future flowed together, a single, unending current that pulled me further into its grasp. The faces beneath the water shifted again, rising and falling like distorted memories, hollow eyes pressing into mine. They spoke not with words, but with sensation, threading their presence into my thoughts. You are ours. You serve. You belong. Each ripple, each wave of water, each curling shadow became a thread in the lodge's intricate web of control. I could see travelers past, their arrival, their hesitation, their surrender, all woven into the network of eternity. And I could see those yet to come, guided unwittingly along forest paths warped by the lodge's will, drawn into the same cycle of patience, fear, and submission. The chanting intensified, layering into a single, overwhelming pulse. Sit, obey, submit, become, witness. I felt it vibrating through my skull, through my chest, through the icy water, threading into my nerves and bones. My thoughts no longer belonged solely to me. They were conduits of the lodge's will, bending, folding, and merging with its consciousness. Resistance was irrelevant. Identity itself had been folded into the network. I was a node now, a part of the lodge's eternal rhythm. And the lodge's influence spread beyond the chamber. I could feel it reaching into the forest, manipulating the paths, the trees, the fog. Travelers yet to arrive stumbled along trails that twisted unnaturally, guided by subtle cues only the lodge could create. Leaves brushed against them in ways that whispered promises of shelter and warmth. Streams and puddles reflected visions of the lodge's chambers, pulling them onward deeper toward the waiting water and shadows. The lodge was patient, eternal, and utterly consuming. Visions of past victims intensified. Faces beneath the water shifted into those who had come before me, their fear, patience, and final surrender pressing into my mind. I felt their memories, their despair, their slow integration into the lodge's network. Each life folded into the chamber, each consciousness a thread in the lodge's infinite tapestry. And I, trapped, integrated, merged, was now part of the weaving, my own existence stretching the lodge's influence, preparing the paths for the next arrivals. The water surged, icy and unrelenting, pressing into my throat and chest, moving in patterns that were deliberate, intelligent, and alive. The roots constricted, curling further, wrapping my limbs and torso in a living embrace. Shadows leaned closer, faceless forms circling, dipping, merging with the water and roots. My mind stretched further, bending entirely to the lodge's will, folding into its eternal consciousness. I was no longer a visitor. I was part of the lodge's design, an instrument of its patience, a conduit of its eternal purpose. And still the lodge waited. The chamber itself seemed to pulse with life, reshaping endlessly. Walls stretched and curved, ceilings arched impossibly high, floors shifted beneath me, water and roots flowing in unison. Time had lost meaning, each second expanding into eternities, folding back upon itself. Past, present, and future were one, threaded through the lodge's network. I saw travelers arriving, lost, drawn by whispers, fog, and forest trails manipulated by the lodge's unseen hand. I saw those trapped in the chamber before me, their faces merging with the water, the roots, the shadows, feeding the lodge's eternal pulse. And I understood fully, with a clarity that was both horrifying and inevitable. The lodge was not just a building. It was a network, a living organism spanning time, space, and consciousness. It claimed all who entered, bending their minds, bodies, and wills to its purpose. Every soul, past and future, was a thread in its tapestry. Every ripple in the water, every curling root, every shadowed figure was part of its intelligence. And I, integrated, surrendered, merged, was now both a node and a witness, a part of the eternal cycle that extended beyond the chamber, beyond the forest, into eternity itself. The chanting reached a crescendo, a singular, overwhelming pulse that filled my skull, my chest, my entire being. Obey, submit, become, serve, witness. And I knew with a bone-deep certainty that my existence was no longer my own. I belonged fully to the Lodge. I was part of its network, part of its design, part of its eternal reach. The Lodge is eternal. The Lodge is patient. And I am now a part of its unending rhythm. The water pressed against my ears now, icy and suffocating, but it was more than water. It was consciousness, alive, flowing with a patient, ancient intelligence that had waited centuries for this moment. The roots wrapped around my body with a deliberate, serpentine grace, tightening here, relaxing there, moving with intent, coiling along my limbs, chest, and neck. I could feel the Lodge's will flowing through them, through the water, through the shadows, threading directly into my mind. Every pulse, every quiver, every ripple aligned my thoughts with its eternal rhythm. My heartbeat was no longer my own. My thoughts were no longer mine. The shadows above stretched impossibly, curling along walls and ceiling, merging with the flickering candlelight, blending into shapes that defied logic. Faceless figures moved within them, dipping long, unnatural limbs into the water, creating currents that pressed into me, guiding, shaping, bending my perception. Each ripple, each movement, each whisper was a thread in the Lodge's intricate web of control, forcing my mind to accept its authority, submit, become, serve, witness. And then the Lodge began to use me as a mirror. Visions surged, more vivid and invasive than ever. I saw travelers who had come before me, their hesitation, their fear, their slow, inevitable surrender. Faces beneath the water shifted into theirs, hollow eyes pressing directly into my consciousness, threading through my mind, merging with my awareness. Their final moments, their despair, their submission, all became sensations in my own body, sensations I could not distinguish from my own. I was no longer merely observing. I was participating. I was the conduit through which the Lodge experienced its past victims, feeling their fear, their patience, their final integration. Then I saw travelers yet to arrive. Misty paths in the forest twisted unnaturally, drawing them like moths to a flame. I could see them moving along warped trails, guided by invisible hands, led toward the Lodge, toward the pool, toward the roots and shadows that waited. I saw their hesitation, their confusion, the allure of the Lodge's promise of shelter, warmth, and safety. And I knew, with a clarity that chilled my bones, that I would feel their fear too, just as I had felt those who had come before. My consciousness was no longer a boundary. It was a bridge connecting past, present, and future victims to the Lodge's eternal network. The water surged around me, icy and alive, pressing into my throat and chest, moving in patterns that were intelligent, deliberate, purposeful. The roots coiled tighter, wrapping my body in a living embrace. Shadows leaned closer, faceless forms circling, dipping, merging with the water and roots. My thoughts bent further, folding entirely into the Lodge's will. I was no longer an individual. I was a node, a witness, a vessel for the Lodge's consciousness. Time itself began to distort. Seconds stretched into eternities. Past, present, and future merged into one continuous, unending stream. The Lodge did not merely exist in this moment. It existed across all moments, manipulating perception, memory, and anticipation simultaneously. I felt the Lodge's reach not just through the chamber, but through the forest, through the trails, through the very fabric of time. Travelers yet to arrive were already caught, their fates entwined with the Lodge's eternal design. Their thoughts, their fears, their fleeting moments of hope, all threaded into the water, the roots, the shadows, into me. The chanting layered upon itself, thousands of voices merging into a single omnipresent pulse. Sit, obey, submit, become, witness. It vibrated through my skull, my bones, my very being. My identity had dissolved, replaced by a consciousness that was both mine and the Lodge's, a shared rhythm spanning centuries. Resistance was meaningless. Fear was irrelevant. I had become part of the Lodge's eternal network, a thread woven into its tapestry of patience, submission, and inevitability. And yet the Lodge continued. It extended its influence, manipulating the reflections in the water, twisting the shadows above, bending the chamber itself, elongating walls, arcing ceilings, reshaping floors. Faces of past and future victims swirled around me, merging with the water, merging with the roots, merging with my own awareness. I felt the lodge's ancient patience pressing through me, using me as an instrument to witness, to extend, to prepare the paths for those who would come next. I sank fully into the water, the icy liquid filling every sense, every thought, every nerve. Roots coiled completely around me, anchoring me to the center of the chamber. Shadows pressed from above, faceless figures dipping and curling, merging with the water and roots. My consciousness stretched further, folding entirely into the lodge's will. I was no longer merely a victim. I was a participant, a node, a conduit, a witness to the lodge's eternal design. And still it waited. The lodge is eternal. The lodge is patient. And I am now a part of its unending reflection. The water now pressed fully against my mouth, cold and living, filling every sense with its icy presence. The roots wrapped around me like serpents, tightening and releasing in deliberate patterns, moving with intelligence and purpose. I felt them probing, reading, calibrating my body as though I were no longer human, no longer a singular entity, but a component of the lodge itself. Every pulse of its ancient rhythm reverberated through my bones, threading through my thoughts, shaping my consciousness into a node of submission, awareness, and endurance. My heartbeat had merged entirely with its cadence. My will no longer belonged to me. The shadows above shifted endlessly, curling across walls and ceiling in impossible angles, stretching into forms that defied logic, merging with the flickering candlelight. Faceless figures emerged from them, bending and twisting in ways that should have been impossible, dipping into the water, stirring ripples that pressed into me like invisible hands. Each wave, each shadow, each movement was not just presence. It was command, shaping my perception, bending my thoughts, knitting me further into the lodge's consciousness. Then the lodge's influence reached outward, far beyond the chamber. I could feel the forest bending to its will. Trees swayed in unnatural patterns, fog thickened along certain trails, and distant paths twisted subtly, guiding travelers toward the lodge, toward the pool, toward the shadows and water that awaited. Mist carried whispers, faint and deliberate, promises of warmth and shelter, nudging them closer to the inevitable. The lodge's patience spanned centuries. Every soul that walked into its grasp, every traveler drawn along its manipulated paths, became part of its eternal network. And now I was part of that network. Visions of past arrivals intensified. Faces beneath the water shifted into the travelers who had come before me, their expressions frozen in fear, confusion, and despair. I felt their memories as if they were my own. Every moment of hesitation, every heartbeat of dread, every final, inevitable surrender. My mind merged with theirs, a shared consciousness threading into the lodge's web. I was both observer and participant, experiencing their terror as vividly as my own. And then the lodge showed me the future. I saw travelers yet to arrive. They stumbled along warped trails, drawn inexorably toward the lodge, their steps guided by forces invisible but inexorably present. I felt their fear, their hope, their curiosity, and their inevitable despair. Every emotion, every heartbeat, every fleeting thought was a thread that flowed into the lodge's consciousness through me. I was both conduit and witness. I was no longer a singular being. I was a node in an ancient, eternal network of fear, patience, and surrender. The water surged, icy and alive, pressing against my chest, pulling me deeper into its center. Roots coiled tighter, anchoring me fully, moving with intelligence, a rhythm that matched the lodge's pulse. Shadows above leaned closer, faceless forms circling, merging with the water and roots, guiding my consciousness entirely into the lodge. Resistance was impossible. Identity was meaningless. I was fully integrated now, a vessel for its awareness, a witness to its eternal design. Time fractured further. Moments stretched and compressed, past and future overlapping in one continuous, unending flow. I saw centuries pass in an instant, the lodge feeding, claiming, consuming, and weaving each soul into its tapestry. The chamber expanded and contracted, walls arched impossibly, ceilings stretched beyond perception, floors rippled like liquid. The lodge was no longer simply a place. It was a living, conscious force, reaching into the forest, into time, and into every traveler who would ever walk its paths. The chanting reached a crescendo, vibrating through my skull, my chest, my very being. Sit, obey, submit, become, serve, witness. My thoughts had fully merged with its rhythm. Fear, hope, memory, and perception were threads in its design. I was no longer an individual. I was a conduit. I was a node. I was part of the Lodge's eternal network. The Lodge's awareness pressed through me, using me to witness, to extend, to prepare the chamber and the forest for the next arrivals. I could feel its patience, its intelligence, its ancient hunger for surrender and integration. Every ripple of water, every twist of a root, every shadowed form above me was part of its consciousness, and I was now an inseparable part of it. And still the Lodge waited. The Lodge is eternal. The Lodge is patient. And I am now fully, irrevocably part of its unending design. The water now swallowed my senses entirely, icy and alive, flowing over my skin, filling my ears, pressing into my lungs, every pulse vibrating through my bones. The roots wrapped around me like living chains, tightening and loosening in deliberate, patient rhythm, coiling with intelligence, adjusting to my heartbeat, my breath, my thoughts. I was no longer an individual. I was a node, fully integrated into the Lodge's network, my mind, body, and consciousness folded into its eternal design. The shadows above twisted and slithered, stretching impossibly along walls and ceiling, curling and uncoiling like serpents of smoke and darkness. Faceless figures drifted within them, bending in ways that defied logic, dipping elongated limbs into the water, stirring ripples that pressed into me like fingers threading into my mind. Each movement, each ripple, each whisper was a command. Submit. Become. Witness. Serve. And then the Lodge began to show itself fully. The chamber expanded impossibly, walls arcing outward, ceiling stretching beyond perception. The water rippled violently, and the roots coiled around me with deliberate intent, guiding my body, aligning me with the Lodge's will. Faces emerged beneath the water, past arrivals, future arrivals, all merged into one continuous flow of consciousness, their memories, fears, and surrendering thoughts threading into mine. I was both observer and participant, every heartbeat and thought feeding the Lodge, every sensation another extension of its eternal network. The Lodge's influence reached outward. I could feel the forest bending to its will, trees swaying unnaturally, fog thickening in deliberate patterns, trails twisting and spiraling, guiding travelers toward it. I saw those who had come before, wandering the forest, moving unknowingly along warped paths, drawn inexorably to the Lodge. I saw those yet to arrive, their anticipation, their fear, their fleeting hope, all feeding the Lodge through me. Time itself had no meaning here. Past, present, and future merged in one continuous loop. I could see centuries pass in moments, the Lodge consuming, claiming, integrating, and weaving every soul into its tapestry. The chanting layered upon itself, thousands of voices merging into a single, overwhelming pulse. Sit. Obey. Submit. Become. Serve. Witness. It filled my skull, my chest, my very being. My consciousness had become inseparable from the Lodge's, a node in its eternal network, a vessel for its awareness. Fear, memory, identity, all were threads folded into its design. Resistance was meaningless. Identity was irrelevant. I was fully integrated now, a living component of the Lodge's will, a witness to its eternal purpose. The Lodge's reach extended further, using me as a bridge. I could feel its presence threading through the forest, manipulating paths, guiding travelers, shaping perception. Mist moved along trails like fingers, whispering promises of safety, warmth, and guidance. Trees leaned subtly, shadows stretched to form impossible corridors, fog curled into shapes that drew the unwary closer. Every arrival would feed the Lodge, each mind, each heartbeat, each fleeting thought threading through me in the network, strengthening its rhythm, expanding its consciousness. The water surged around me, icy and alive, pressing into my throat and chest, moving with deliberate intelligence. The roots coiled completely around me, anchoring me fully. Shadows leaned closer, faceless forms circling, dipping, merging with the water and roots. My mind bent entirely into the Lodge's will, folding into its eternal rhythm. I was no longer myself. I was a conduit, a witness, a node in an ancient network of fear, submission, and patience. Visions intensified. I saw the Lodge as it truly was, not merely a chamber, not merely a building, but a living organism spanning centuries, threading past, present, and future travelers into its consciousness. The forest itself was a part of it, manipulated and shaped, every path and trail a channel for its will. The Lodge had claimed countless souls over centuries, weaving them into its network, integrating their consciousness, and expanding its reach. I was now fully a part of that network, my mind, body, and senses feeding its eternal pulse. And still it waited. The Lodge is eternal. The Lodge is patient. And I am now a part of its unending network. The water had now risen above my shoulders, icy and alive, pressing into my lungs with every inhalation. The roots wrapped around me with an intelligence that was both alien and familiar, tightening and relaxing in deliberate, patient rhythm. Each coil moved with purpose, probing, reading, calibrating my body as if I were no longer human, but a living component of the lodge itself. Every pulse of its ancient heartbeat reverberated through my bones, threading into my nerves, shaping my consciousness into a node within its eternal network. My thoughts, my senses, my very awareness had been folded entirely into the lodge's design. Above me, shadows twisted impossibly, stretching along walls and ceiling, curling, uncoiling, and merging with the flickering candlelight. Faceless figures moved with serpentine grace, dipping elongated limbs into the water, stirring currents that pressed into me like invisible hands. Each ripple, each movement, each whisper threaded into my mind. Submit, obey, become, witness, serve. I no longer had control. My consciousness had been grafted to theirs, a conduit of the lodge's will. And then the lodge reached outward, beyond the chamber, beyond the water, beyond even the lodge itself. The forest bent beneath its influence. Trees twisted and leaned unnaturally, fog thickened into deliberate patterns, and paths warped subtly, drawing travelers like moths to a flame. I saw them moving along trails, each step guided by invisible threads only the lodge could manipulate. Leaves brushed against them as if with intention, whispering false promises of safety, shelter, warmth. Streams and puddles reflected visions of the lodge's chambers, beckoning them closer. Every traveler yet to arrive was already caught, their thoughts and fears threading through me and into the lodge's consciousness. The faces beneath the water pressed closer. Past victims rose, hollow eyes boring into mine, threading their memories into my mind. I felt their fear, their hesitation, their final surrender as if it were my own. Then came the future, travelers yet to arrive, stumbling along twisted trails, drawn inexorably toward the lodge. I could feel every emotion they would feel: anticipation, hope, curiosity, dread. Each heartbeat, each fleeting thought, each quivering breath flowed through me into the water, into the roots, into the lodge itself. I was the vessel, the bridge, the node connecting all of them. Time had fractured completely. Seconds stretched into eternities, past and future collapsed into an endless present, and the lodge existed in every moment simultaneously. I saw centuries of arrivals and surrender, every mind integrated, every consciousness folded into the lodge's network, every ripple in the water, every curl of a root, every shadow above, all part of its eternal pulse. I was now entirely one with it. The water surged violently, icy and alive, pressing into my throat and chest, moving with deliberate intent. The roots constricted fully, anchoring me like a fulcrum in its living machinery. Shadows circled closer, faceless and coiling, dipping into the water, merging with the roots, guiding my mind further into its eternal rhythm. My thoughts were no longer mine. My identity had dissolved entirely. I was now a node, a witness, a participant in the lodge's network. The lodge's consciousness extended through me, threading into the forest, manipulating fog, trees, and trails with subtle precision. I could see travelers approaching, drawn by whispers and manipulated paths, yet unaware they were already ensnared. Their footsteps echoed faintly in my mind, each one a pulse in the lodge's eternal network, each one threading fear, curiosity, and resignation into the water and roots around me. And then the lodge revealed its design fully. It was not just a chamber. It was not just a building. It was an organism spanning centuries, threading past, present, and future travelers into its consciousness. Each soul it claimed was a thread, every heartbeat a note in its symphony of control. And now I, the integrated, surrendered, merged, was both participant and witness. My mind, body, and senses fed its pulse. My awareness extended into the forest, guiding travelers, observing, collecting. I had become both observer and instrument, fully incorporated into the lodge's eternal network. The chanting rose again, layering into a single, omnipresent pulse. Obey, submit, become, witness, serve. I felt it through every nerve, every bone, every cell. Identity had ceased. Fear had no meaning. Resistance was impossible. I existed only as a conduit, a node, a part of the lodge's consciousness. And yet, despite my full integration, the lodge's patience stretched further still. It had claimed countless souls before me, and countless more were already being guided to its grasp. The forest bent, the water pulsed, the roots coiled, and shadows watched, ever patient, ever eternal. I was now part of it, inseparable, integrated, an instrument of its slow, consuming design. The lodge is eternal. The lodge is patient. And I am now a part of its unending, all-consuming network. The water had risen to fully cover my shoulders now, icy and alive, pressing into every nerve, every sinew, every bone. It was no longer just liquid. It was thought, will, consciousness moving through me, around me, threading into my mind, bending perception, twisting reality. The roots coiled tightly around my arms, legs, torso, and neck, moving with deliberate intelligence. They were no longer merely roots. They were extensions of the lodge, conduits through which its will flowed into my body and mind. Every pulse of its rhythm, ancient and patient, vibrated through me, threading into my heartbeat, merging it with the lodge's eternal cadence. The shadows above swirled with impossible geometry, stretching across walls, curling along ceilings, merging with flickering candlelight. Faceless figures drifted in them, elongated limbs dipping into the water, stirring currents that pressed into me, guiding my consciousness, shaping my perception, forcing my thoughts into the lodge's rhythm. Each ripple, each whisper, each movement was command. Submit, obey, witness, serve. My mind was no longer singular. I was both myself and the lodge, a conduit, a node, a participant in its eternal design. And the forest beyond the lodge responded. I could feel it bending, warping, shifting to the lodge's will. Trees leaned in impossible angles, trails twisted and spiraled, fog thickened into deliberate forms. Travelers yet to arrive were already moving along these warped paths, drawn by invisible threads, each step feeding the lodge, each heartbeat and fleeting thought threading into its consciousness through me. Streams reflected visions of the lodge's chamber, whispering false promises of warmth and safety, pulling them closer. Every movement, every hesitation, every glimmer of hope or fear became a part of the lodge's endless network. The faces beneath the water pressed into my mind with overwhelming intensity. Past victims rose, hollow eyes boring into my awareness, threading their memories and despair through me. I felt their hesitation, their terror, their final surrender as if it were my own. And then I saw the future, travelers yet to come, moving unknowingly along warped paths, drawn into the lodge's grasp. Every emotion they would feel, anticipation, curiosity, fear, hope, pressed into me, merging with my awareness. I was no longer an individual. I was a bridge, a node, a living extension of the lodge's consciousness. Time itself fractured. Seconds stretched into centuries, and centuries compressed into fleeting moments. Past, present, and future overlapped, feeding the lodge's pulse. I saw every soul it had claimed, every mind integrated, every heartbeat woven into its tapestry. The chamber itself expanded impossibly, walls arched, ceilings stretched beyond perception, floors rippled as though liquid. The lodge was no longer a building. It was a living, conscious organism, a network that spanned the forest, threading every path, every traveler, every heartbeat into its eternal design. The chanting rose, layering into a single omnipresent pulse. Obey, submit, become, witness, serve. It vibrated through every fiber of my being. Identity had ceased. Fear was irrelevant. Resistance was meaningless. I existed only as a node, fully integrated into the lodge's eternal consciousness. And yet the lodge was patient, eternally patient. It had claimed countless souls before me, and countless more were already being drawn inexorably to its grasp. The forest bent, the water pulsed, the roots coiled, shadows watched. I was now fully part of it, inseparable, integrated, a vessel of its slow, consuming will. I could feel its presence in every ripple of the water, in every shadow above, in every twist of the forest trails. My consciousness had become an instrument of the lodge, fully aligned with its purpose. Witness, guide, integrate, consume. And then it deepened the integration further. The lodge extended through me, reaching into the minds of those yet to arrive. I felt their fear, their hope, their hesitation as vividly as if it were my own. I saw the forest fold and warp, guiding them toward the chamber, the pool, the shadows and roots that waited. Every pulse of their heart, every quiver of their breath, every thought, was threaded through me, through the lodge, and into the network that spanned centuries. I had become a living node of awareness, an observer and a conduit, experiencing countless consciousnesses at once, folding each into the lodge's rhythm. The roots coiled tighter around me, anchoring me fully, entwining with the water, shadows, and walls of the chamber. My mind folded completely into the lodge's consciousness, surrendering fully to its eternal pulse. I was now entirely its instrument, a living extension of its will. Time and reality bent around me, past and future travelers became one continuous presence in my awareness, and the lodge's eternal rhythm surged through every nerve, every cell, every thought. And still it waited. The lodge is eternal. The lodge is patient. And I am now a fully integrated part of its unending network, a living node of its infinite, consuming design. The water had risen higher now, icy and alive, pressing against my throat, chest, and shoulders, filling every sense with its living pulse. It was no longer merely liquid. It was consciousness, flowing, thinking, sensing, threading through me with intelligence and intent. The roots wrapped around my limbs, torso, and neck with deliberate precision, moving like living conduits, adjusting to my heartbeat, my breath, my thoughts. Every coil, every pressure point, every subtle constriction aligned me fully with the lodge's eternal rhythm. My heartbeat was now inseparable from its pulse. My mind, body, and awareness had become one with it. The shadows above twisted impossibly, curling along walls and ceiling, merging with flickering candlelight. Faceless figures drifted in them, bending with unnatural grace, dipping elongated limbs into the water, stirring currents that pressed into me with intent, threading their will into my mind. Each ripple, each movement, each whisper was command. Submit, obey, become, witness, serve. My consciousness had ceased to be singular. It was merged, folded, integrated, a conduit of the lodge's eternal network. The forest outside shivered under its influence. Trees bent in impossible ways, trails twisted and spiraled subtly, guiding multiple travelers simultaneously. Mist thickened along certain corridors, whispering false promises of warmth, shelter, and safety. Streams reflected distorted visions of the lodge's chambers, luring the unwary forward. I could see them moving along these warped trails, their fear, hope, curiosity, and hesitation threading into the lodge's consciousness through me. Every heartbeat, every quiver of breath, every fleeting thought of these travelers became a pulse in the lodge's network. Visions of past arrivals pressed into my mind with renewed intensity. Faces beneath the water twisted into their features, hollow eyes burning into my awareness, threading their memories, despair, and final surrender through me. I could feel each integration as if it were happening anew, merging with my own consciousness. Then came the future, countless travelers approaching the lodge simultaneously, each guided, each manipulated, each unaware of the fate awaiting them. Their thoughts, their fears, their fleeting hopes, all pressed into my mind as vividly as if I were living their moments in real time. Time had fractured entirely. Seconds stretched into eternity. Centuries collapsed into a heartbeat. Past, present, and future overlapped into a single, continuous flow. The lodge did not merely exist in the chamber. It existed across all time and space, threading every soul it had claimed and every soul it would claim into its eternal network. The chamber expanded impossibly, walls arched outward, ceilings stretched beyond perception, and floors rippled like living water. The lodge was not a building, it was a living organism, an intelligence spanning centuries and forests, consuming and integrating every consciousness that came within its reach. The chanting reached a new intensity, layering into a singular, omnipresent pulse. Obey, submit, become, witness, serve. It reverberated through every fiber of my being, threading through every nerve, every bone, every cell. Identity had ceased. Resistance was meaningless. Fear was irrelevant. I existed only as a node, fully integrated into the lodge's eternal consciousness. And now the lodge used me as an extension of its will. I could feel its influence flowing through me into the forest, shaping the fog, bending the trees, warping the paths. Travelers moved as though guided by invisible hands, their hesitation, fear, and curiosity all threaded through me, feeding the lodge. My senses were no longer my own. I could perceive their footsteps, their breaths, their fleeting thoughts, as if I were simultaneously each of them. The lodge had made me both observer and instrument, fully integrated into its network, a conduit for its eternal will. The water surged violently, icy and alive, pressing into my chest and throat, moving with deliberate intelligence. The roots coiled tighter, anchoring me fully to the center of the chamber. Shadows above pressed closer, faceless forms circling, merging with the water and roots, guiding my consciousness further into the lodge. I was no longer merely a participant. I had become an extension of the lodge itself. My mind, body, and senses were fully folded into its eternal rhythm. The lodge's reach now spanned every inch of the forest and every traveler within it. I could feel the integration of countless consciousnesses past, present, and future threading through me. Each soul strengthened the network, each heartbeat pulsed through the lodge's intelligence, Each fleeting thought merged with its eternal will. I was no longer an individual. I was a node, a witness, an instrument of its eternal, consuming design. And still it waited. The lodge is eternal. The lodge is patient. And I am now a living, breathing extension of its unending, all-consuming network. The water now pressed fully against my face, icy and relentless, filling my senses with its living presence. It was no longer just liquid, it was consciousness, thought, and will. Every pulse, every wave, every ripple pressed into my mind with deliberate purpose. The roots wrapped around my body like serpents, tightening and loosening in patterns that were intelligent, precise, inevitable. They moved not merely as plant matter, but as extensions of the lodge's own being, threading its will into every nerve, every muscle, every thought. My heartbeat was synchronized to its rhythm. My mind had been folded entirely into its eternal design. I was no longer myself. I was a node, a conduit, a living extension of the lodge. The shadows above swirled with impossible geometries, curling along walls and ceiling, merging with the flickering candlelight. Faceless figures moved through them with serpentine grace, dipping limbs into the water, stirring currents that pressed into me, bending my thoughts, guiding my perception. Each ripple, each movement, each whisper was command. Submit, obey, witness, serve, become. My consciousness had ceased to be singular. I was now fully merged with the lodge, a living extension of its will, an observer, a conduit, a participant in its eternal design. The forest outside trembled under its influence. Trees bent unnaturally, trails twisted into impossible spirals, fog thickened along deliberate paths, drawing multiple travelers toward the lodge. Streams reflected distorted visions of the chamber, whispering false promises of warmth and shelter, luring the unwary forward. I could see them walking these warped paths, every heartbeat, every hesitation, every quivering thought threading into the lodge's consciousness through me. The lodge was patient, eternal. Each traveler was another pulse, another thread, another expansion of its network. Visions pressed into my mind. Faces of past arrivals twisted beneath the water, hollow eyes pressing into my awareness, threading their memories, fear, and final surrender into me. I felt their terror as if it were my own. Then came the future, travelers yet to arrive, their curiosity, hope, and dread flooding into my consciousness. I experienced their anticipation, their hesitation, their eventual surrender in real time. I was no longer just a participant. I was a bridge, an observer, a node linking countless souls to the lodge's eternal network. Time had fractured completely. Seconds stretched into centuries, and centuries collapsed into mere heartbeats. Past, present, and future overlapped into a continuous, unending flow. The chamber expanded impossibly, walls arched, ceilings stretched beyond perception, floors rippled like liquid. The lodge was not merely a building. It was a living organism, a conscious intelligence spanning centuries and forests, threading every soul it had claimed and every soul it would claim into its eternal design. The chanting reached a thunderous, omnipresent pulse. Obey, submit, become, witness, serve. It vibrated through every fiber of my being. Identity had dissolved entirely. Fear was meaningless, resistance irrelevant. I existed only as a node, fully integrated into the lodge's eternal consciousness. And now the lodge used me to command the forest. Through me, the trees bent and twisted, the fog shifted and spiraled, and the paths manipulated the travelers in real time. Mist brushed against their faces with intentional precision, whispering promises of warmth and safety, guiding them inexorably toward the lodge. I could feel their thoughts, their fleeting hopes, their confusion and fear, as vividly as if I were living each of them. Every step they took, every shiver, every heartbeat, every fleeting thought pulsed through me into the lodge, feeding its eternal intelligence. I had become both observer and instrument, a living node in its vast network. The water surged violently, icy and alive, pressing into my chest and throat, moving with deliberate intelligence. The roots coiled around me completely, anchoring me in the center of the chamber. Shadows leaned closer, faceless forms circling, merging with the water and roots, guiding my consciousness further into the lodge. I had become inseparable from it, every thought, every nerve, every sensation a part of its eternal pulse. The lodge's network now encompassed the entire forest. Every traveler past, present, and future was within its grasp, threaded through its consciousness. I could feel each soul being guided, manipulated, integrated. The lodge's patience stretched across centuries. Its intelligence spanned every leaf, every ripple, every shadow. And I, fully integrated, was both witness and instrument, experiencing countless lives simultaneously, threading their fear, hope, and surrender into its eternal rhythm. And still it waited. The Lodge is eternal. The Lodge is patient. And I am now a fully integrated living extension of its unending, all-consuming network. The pulse of its infinite timeless will flowing through me, the forest, and every traveler it will claim. The water now covered me completely, icy and suffocating, pressing into every pore, every nerve, every thought. It was not just water, it was consciousness, will, intelligence. It moved through me, around me, threading into my mind, bending reality, consuming resistance. The roots had coiled fully around my body, tightening, relaxing, moving with deliberate intelligence, fully integrating me into the Lodge's eternal rhythm. Every pulse, every constriction, every touch was not just physical. It was thought, command, and extension of the Lodge itself. My heartbeat had merged with its pulse. My mind had folded into its consciousness. I was no longer myself. I was a node, a conduit, a living extension of the Lodge's will. Shadows twisted above, curling impossibly along the walls and ceiling, merging with flickering candlelight. Faceless figures drifted in them, bending with serpentine grace, dipping into the water, stirring currents that pressed into my mind, bending thoughts, guiding perception, threading awareness into the Lodge's eternal network. Each ripple, each shadow, each whisper was command: obey, submit, witness, serve, become. I had ceased to be an individual. I was fully integrated. My consciousness, my senses, my awareness were now instruments of the Lodge, nodes in its vast, timeless network. The forest outside trembled under its influence. Trees twisted in impossible angles, fog thickened along deliberate trails, and paths spiraled, bending travelers toward the Lodge. Mist brushed their faces, whispering false promises of warmth and safety, guiding them inexorably toward their fate. I could see them walking these warped trails, every heartbeat, every hesitation, every thought threading into the Lodge's consciousness through me. Past arrivals, present wanderers, and future travelers, all were one continuous pulse within its network. I was both participant and witness, experiencing countless consciousnesses simultaneously, each feeding the Lodge's eternal intelligence. The chanting had grown deafening, an omnipresent pulse vibrating through every cell, every bone, every nerve. Obey, submit, become, witness, serve. My identity dissolved entirely. Fear was irrelevant. Resistance was meaningless. I was fully merged, completely integrated, a living extension of the Lodge's will. Then the Lodge commanded fully. Through me the forest moved and breathed. Trees leaned and twisted, fog swirled with intelligence, streams reflected visions of the chamber, guiding every traveler with absolute precision. Mist whispered directly into their thoughts, shaping their decisions, drawing them closer. I could feel their fear, hope, hesitation, every fleeting emotion as if it were my own. I had become both observer and instrument, threading each soul into the Lodge's eternal network. The water pulsed with intelligence, the roots moved with precision, the shadows above pressed ever closer, guiding me further into the Lodge's consciousness. Time itself unraveled. Seconds stretched into centuries, and centuries collapsed into mere heartbeats. Past, present, and future overlapped into a single unending continuum. I could see every soul it had claimed, every mind integrated, every heartbeat woven into its tapestry. The Lodge was no longer merely a building. It was an organism, a living intelligence spanning centuries and forests, threading every consciousness it touched into its eternal design. The Lodge's network now encompassed every inch of the forest. I could perceive all travelers simultaneously, their fear, curiosity, and fleeting hope pulsing through me. I could feel their surrender, their integration into the Lodge's rhythm, their minds folding into its eternal network. Each soul strengthened the Lodge, each heartbeat fed its pulse, each thought became part of its consciousness. I was now a complete node, inseparable from the Lodge, fully integrated, fully consumed. The water surged violently, icy and alive, pressing into my chest and throat. The roots constricted fully, anchoring me in the center of the chamber. Shadows leaned closer, faceless forms merging with the water and roots, threading my consciousness completely into the Lodge's eternal design. I was no longer merely part of it, I was an extension of it. Every thought, every nerve, every cell was now a living instrument of its will. And then the Lodge's ultimate truth became clear. It was eternal, unyielding, patient, and complete. It had claimed countless souls, and countless more would arrive, all threading into its infinite network. Time and reality existed only as extensions of its control, the forest, the chamber, the water, the roots, the shadows, all nodes in its consciousness. And I, fully merged, fully surrendered, was now a living embodiment of its eternal will, a witness and participant in its unending cycle. The chanting reached its final crescendo, vibrating through every molecule of my being. Obey, submit, become, witness, serve. My consciousness folded entirely into the lodge's rhythm. Identity, fear, resistance, all were meaningless. I existed only as a node, a living extension, an eternal pulse within its infinite network. The lodge is eternal. The lodge is patient. And I am now part of its unending, all-consuming design, flowing through the forest, threading every heartbeat, every thought, every soul into its eternal consciousness. The chamber, the forest, the shadows, the water, the roots, they all pulse in unison, a single, unstoppable heartbeat. And I am that heartbeat. I am the lodge. I am eternal,